She was a lady by birth, an outlaw by necessity, and a legend by force of will. Lady Bandit, a wild Western action-adventure. Chapter 1. Pearl Elizabeth Taylor, you will sit up straight this instant. Pearl's spine snapped to attention at her mother's voice, though her eyes remained fixed on the traveling carnival setting up across the street. The tent stakes drove into the frozen ground with sharp, metallic rings that carried through the parlor's lace curtains. Mother, look at that. Pearl pressed her nose against the frost-etched window. They've got a dancing bear. Ladies do not press their faces to glass like street urchins. Eleanor Taylor's reflection appeared beside Pearl's in the window, her mouth a thin line of disapproval. And ladies certainly do not concern themselves with such diversions. The bear wasn't dancing. It swayed back and forth on a chain while a man in a red coat cracked a whip near its feet. Pearl could see the animal's breath, steaming in the February cold. Perhaps the bear doesn't want to dance. What bears want is hardly relevant to our conversation about proper deportment. Eleanor guided Pearl away from the window, with firm hands on her shoulders. Your father expects you to make a suitable impression on the Hendricks family tonight. Mrs. Hendricks has a son your age. Pearl dropped into the horsehair chair beside the fireplace. William Hendricks has webbed toes. How could you possibly know such a thing? Tommy Morrison told me. Said William showed them off at the swimming hole last summer. Pearl picked at the chair's brass tacks. Said they looked like a duck's feet. Eleanor's cheeks flushed pink. Thomas Morrison is a vulgar child from a vulgar family. You will not repeat such gossip. It's not gossip if it's true. Pearl. The warning in her mother's voice made Pearl look up. Eleanor stood with her hands clasped, wearing the same expression she got when Pearl tracked mud through the front hall or spoke French to the grocer's wife. Your father has worked very hard to establish our position in this community. The bank, our home, your education, none of it came easily. Eleanor smoothed her skirts. Young ladies from good families marry young gentlemen from good families. It's the natural order. Pearl's fingers found a loose tack and worried it back and forth. What if the young lady doesn't want to marry the young gentleman? Want has very little to do with it. Through the window came the sound of hammering and men shouting instructions. Pearl could smell wood smoke from the carnival's cook fires mixing with the potpourri her mother kept in china bowls throughout the house. I think I'd rather join the carnival. Eleanor's laugh held no humor. And do what, exactly? Shovel elephant dung? Maybe. Pearl pulled the tack free and held it up to catch the afternoon light. Or maybe I'd learn to walk the tightrope. Tommy Morrison said the carnival lady in the spangled dress can walk across a rope blindfolded. Thomas Morrison says many things. The front door opened with a blast of cold air, followed by her father's heavy footsteps in the hall. James Taylor appeared in the doorway, snow dusting the shoulders of his dark coat, his beard frosted white around the edges. Ladies. He pulled off his gloves, finger by finger. I trust you're both prepared for this evening's engagement. Of course. Eleanor moved to help him with his coat. Pearl has been looking forward to meeting young William. Pearl's father studied her with banker's eyes that missed nothing. Have you, my dear? I suppose. Pearl rolled the brass tack between her palms. Does he really have webbed toes? James Taylor's mouth twitched. I believe that's a question best left for Mrs. Hendricks. James. Eleanor's voice carried a sharp edge. Though I imagine it would make him an excellent swimmer. Her father's eyes held a glint of something that might have been mischief. Quite the advantage in certain circumstances. Pearl grinned. Her mother made a sound like steam escaping from a kettle. The Hendricks boy is from an excellent family, Eleanor said. His father owns the largest grain operation in 3 counties. Grain. Pearl tested the word like it tasted sour. How exciting. More exciting than you might think. James settled into his chair and began unlacing his boots. Young William will inherit quite a substantial operation. Enough to keep a wife in comfort for many years. But what if the wife wants to do something besides be kept in comfort? Her parents exchanged a look over her head. Pearl had seen that look before, usually right before they sent her to her room to think about her behavior. Such as, her father asked. Pearl glanced toward the window, where the carnival workers continued their setup. A woman in men's trousers was directing the placement of a large striped tent, gesturing with confident sweeps of her arms. I don't know yet. Something important. Marriage is important, Eleanor said. Motherhood is important. Managing a household. But what if I want to travel? See places besides Lindsay? Pearl stood and moved back to the window. The woman in trousers was climbing a rope ladder with quick, sure movements. What if I want to go to California? Or Arizona Territory? Arizona. Eleanor's voice rose. Pearl, Arizona is full of desperados and Indians. It's no place for civilized people. How do you know? Have you been there? I certainly have not. Pearl pressed her palm against the cold glass. The woman had reached the top of the tent and was securing guy ropes with practiced efficiency. She moved like she'd done it 1,000 times, like she belonged up there with the wind pulling at her hair. The Hendricks are expecting us at 7, Eleanor said. You'll wear your blue dress with the pearl buttons. And Pearl? She waited until Pearl turned around. You will be gracious. You will smile. You will allow William to escort you to dinner without any mention of webbed appendages. Yes, Mother. But Pearl's fingers were already working at the window latch. And when her parents left the room to dress for dinner, she pushed it open just wide enough to catch the sound of the carnival workers calling to each other in the growing dusk. Somewhere in those voices was a language she didn't yet speak, but wanted desperately to learn. The brass tack felt warm in her palm as she slipped it into her dress pocket and headed upstairs to put on blue silk and pearl buttons for a boy with duck feet who would inherit grain elevators and expect her to be grateful. Chapter 2. Miss Taylor, you shuffle cards like a professional. Pearl looked up from the deck in her hands to find a man watching her from across the Hendricks parlor. He wasn't William. This one had all his fingers and presumably normal toes. Dark hair slicked back with pomade, a mustache waxed to sharp points, and eyes the color of whiskey in lamplight. My father taught me. Pearl dealt herself 5 cards, face down on the mahogany side table. He says a lady should know enough about cards to avoid being cheated. Smart man. The stranger moved closer, his boots making no sound on the Persian rug. Though some might say knowing too much about cards is dangerous for a lady. More dangerous than knowing too little. He laughed, and the sound made something flutter in Pearl's chest. Definitely more interesting. Across the room, William Hendricks was explaining grain storage techniques to 2 elderly women who looked ready to collapse from boredom. His voice carried the nasal quality of someone accustomed to being listened to, whether or not he had anything worth saying. You're not from Lindsay. Pearl turned over her first card, Queen of Hearts. Guilty as charged. Name's Frederick Hart, but my friends call me Hart. He gestured toward an empty chair. May I? Pearl nodded toward the seat. Her mother would have something to say about entertaining unmarried gentlemen without proper introduction, but Eleanor was occupied helping Mrs. Hendricks serve refreshments to the other guests. Hart settled into the chair and produced his own deck of cards with a flourish that suggested considerable practice. Cared to make the evening more interesting? What did you have in mind? 5-card draw. Nothing too scandalous. His fingers moved over the cards like water. We could play for matchsticks. Or we could play for something more valuable. Pearl picked up her cards and fanned them out. 2 queens, a jack, and a pair of 7s. Not terrible, but not great either. Such as information. Pearl discarded the jack and 7s, keeping the queens. Winner gets to ask the loser any question they want. Truth required. Hart's eyebrows rose. That could be more dangerous than money. I thought we'd established I prefer danger to boredom. He dealt her 3 new cards. Pearl tried not to react when she saw the 3rd queen nestled between a 4 and a 9. 3 queens. Hart was studying his own cards with the focused attention of a cat watching a mouse hole. I'll raise you, he said. Winner gets to ask any question, and the loser has to answer truthfully and completely. Pearl met his gaze across the table. Up close, she could see a small scar running through his left eyebrow, and the way his collar was frayed at the edges despite his confident manner. You're not wealthy. She laid her cards face down. Is that your question? No. Just an observation. Pearl glanced around the Hendricks parlor, with its crystal chandelier and silk wallpaper. So what brings a man without money to a gathering of Lindsay's finest families? Business opportunity. Hart's smile revealed teeth that were white, but slightly crooked. Your father's bank holds the note on several properties I'm interested in acquiring. And you thought you'd charm your way into his good graces by attending his friends' social gatherings? Something like that. He gestured toward her cards. Are we playing or conducting interviews? Pearl turned over her hand. The 3 queens lay in a neat row, flanked by the 4 and 9 like ladies-in-waiting attending their mistresses. Hart whistled low. Well played, Miss Taylor. He revealed his own cards, 2 pairs, aces and 8s. Respectable, but not enough. My question, Pearl said, leaning forward. What kind of business are you really in? Hart gathered the cards and began shuffling with quick practice movements. The kind that requires a man to be good with cards, quick with numbers, and comfortable traveling at short notice. Gambling. Among other things. He dealt a new hand. Your turn to ante up. Truth for truth. Pearl picked up her cards, nothing worth keeping except a lone ace of spades. What would you like to know? What you really think of young William over there? She glanced toward William, who was now demonstrating proper grain grading techniques using dinner rolls as examples. One of the elderly women had actually fallen asleep. I think he's exactly what my parents want for me. Stable. Predictable. Safe. Pearl discarded 4 cards and drew new ones. I think marrying him would be like being buried alive, except with better china. Hart's laugh drew looks from several other guests, including Eleanor, who frowned in their direction. Your mother's watching us. She's been watching me my entire life. Pearl examined her new cards, still nothing. Waiting for me to make the wrong choice, say the wrong thing, disappoint the right people. And have you made the wrong choice? Pearl considered her cards, Hart's face, and the feeling that had been building in her chest all evening, like standing at the edge of a cliff and wondering what it would feel like to jump. Not yet. She folded her hand and stood. But the evening's still young. Hart rose as well, offering his arm. Perhaps you'd like to take some air. I notice there's quite a carnival across from your house. Through the tall windows, Pearl could see the carnival lights twinkling in the distance. The sound of fiddle music drifted across the February night, wild and free, and nothing like the careful parlor songs she'd been taught to play. Eleanor appeared at Pearl's elbow, as if summoned by maternal instinct. Pearl, dear, Mrs. Hendricks is about to serve dessert. Mr. Hart was just suggesting we take a brief walk. Pearl kept her voice level and polite. The air in here is rather close. I'm afraid that wouldn't be appropriate without a proper chaperone. Eleanor's smile could have cut glass. Perhaps Mr. Hart would care to join us for dessert instead. Hart's eyes met Pearl's over Eleanor's head. In them she saw amusement, challenge, and something else, a recognition that passed between them like a spark jumping across a gap. Actually, Mrs. Taylor, I was hoping to discuss some business matters with your husband. Hart produced a calling card from his vest pocket. Perhaps Miss Taylor could show me the way to his study. Eleanor took the card and examined it with the suspicion of a bank examiner reviewing questionable collateral. Mr. Frederick Hart, investment opportunities. Real estate, primarily. I understand Mr. Taylor has extensive knowledge of properties throughout the county. Pearl watched her mother weigh propriety against the possibility of advantageous business connections. Eleanor's desire to advance the family's social position warred with her instinct to keep Pearl away from handsome strangers with questionable credentials. Very well. Pearl, you may escort Mr. Hart to your father's study. Briefly. Pearl took Hart's offered arm, feeling the solid warmth of him through the wool of his coat. As they walked toward the hallway, she heard William Hendricks launch into an explanation of modern threshing techniques. Investment opportunities? She murmured as they reached the study door. I invest in possibilities. Hart's voice was low, meant for her ears alone. Question is, Miss Taylor, are you interested in a return on investment? Pearl's hand was on the study door handle when she heard footsteps behind them. She turned to see William Hendricks approaching with determined strides, his pale eyes fixed on Hart with obvious displeasure. I say, Taylor, who's this fellow? William's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being the most important young man in any room. Pearl felt Hart's arm tense under her hand, saw his free hand drift toward his coat pocket where she now noticed a suspicious bulge that definitely wasn't another deck of cards. The brass tack from that afternoon was still in her dress pocket, warm against her fingers, as she stepped between the two men and knocked firmly on her father's study door. Chapter 3. You're bleeding on the floor. Pearl lifted her head from where she knelt beside the wash basin, one hand pressed to her split lip. Hart stood in the doorway of their rented room above Mooney's saloon, his knuckles scraped raw, his shirt torn at the shoulder. Your floor. Pearl dipped the cloth in the basin again, watching the water turn pink. I paid the rent this month. Hart stepped inside and shut the door with his boot heel. The lock had been broken for 3 weeks, ever since he'd kicked it in during their last argument about the money missing from the coffee tin. How much did we lose? Pearl kept her voice steady, though her hands shook as she wrung out the cloth. Does it matter? Hart collapsed into the room's single chair, which groaned under his weight. You'll just find something else to blame me for. Pearl stood slowly, testing her balance. Her left eye was swelling shut, and something in her ribs sent sharp pains through her chest when she breathed too deep. Through the thin walls came the sound of piano music from the saloon below, punctuated by drunken laughter and the occasional crash of breaking glass. The baby needs milk. She moved to the window that overlooked the alley behind the saloon. Mrs. Henderson said she'd give us credit for another week, but after that, the baby needs a lot of things. Pearl turned from the window. Hart was studying his damaged knuckles like they belonged to someone else. His dark hair hung over his forehead, and she could smell whiskey and tobacco and something else, perfume that wasn't hers. Where were you last night? Working. At 3 a.m? Hart's laugh held no humor. You think poker players keep bankers' hours? Pearl moved to the corner where a wooden crate served as a cradle. Inside, wrapped in a quilt her mother had sent from Lindsay, their daughter slept with tiny fists curled against her cheeks. 6 months old, and already too thin, though Pearl fed her first whenever there was food to be shared. She's getting sick. Pearl touched the baby's forehead with the back of her hand. She's warm, and she's not eating right. Babies get sick. It's what they do. This baby gets sick because we can't afford proper food or medicine or a room that doesn't have rats in the walls. Hart stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. You think I don't know that? You think I enjoy watching my daughter waste away because I can't keep money in my pocket for more than 5 minutes? Your daughter. Pearl kept her voice low to avoid waking the baby, but the words came out sharp enough to cut. When did you start claiming her? Usually, you're too busy drinking away whatever you win to notice she exists. Hart's face went dark. Pearl had learned to recognize that look, the tightening around his eyes, the way his jaw set like a trap about to spring. She positioned herself between him and the baby's crate. You want to blame someone for our situation? Hart stepped closer, and Pearl caught that unfamiliar perfume scent again, stronger now. Look in a mirror. I never asked you to keep the baby. You made that choice. She's our child. She's your responsibility. I told you what would happen if you insisted on keeping her. Pearl's hand found the kitchen knife she'd started keeping within reach during their arguments. The handle was worn smooth from use, and the blade was sharp enough to cut through bone if necessary. You told me a lot of things. She shifted her weight, ready to move if he came closer. You told me you loved me. You told me things would be different once we were married. You told me the gambling was temporary. Hart's eyes flicked to the knife in her hand, then back to her face. Things change, Pearl. People change. You haven't changed. You've just stopped pretending to be someone else. The baby stirred in her crate, making the soft mewling sounds that meant she'd wake soon and want feeding. Pearl had maybe enough milk for one more bottle, and after that she'd have to find money somewhere or watch her daughter go hungry again. There's a game tonight. Hart moved toward the door. Big one. Cattle buyers from Denver, cash money on the table. How big? Big enough to get us out of here. Maybe head west, try our luck in the territories. Pearl had heard variations of this promise before. The big game that would solve everything, the score that would change their luck, the fresh start that stayed perpetually just out of reach. What happens when you lose? What makes you think I'll lose? Because you always lose, Hart. You win just enough to keep hope alive. Then you lose everything plus whatever you can borrow or steal or charm out of people stupid enough to trust you. Hart's hand was on the door handle now. Maybe you'd prefer I didn't come back. Pearl looked at her daughter, sleeping in a crate in a room that smelled like stale beer and broken promises. She thought about the letters from her mother, filled with news about Lindsay's society and careful questions about when Pearl might visit. She thought about the life she'd traded away for a man with whiskey-colored eyes and hands that knew how to shuffle cards, but not how to build anything that lasted. Maybe I would. Hart paused with the door halfway open. You don't mean that. Don't I? For a moment, he stood there, silhouetted against the hallway's dim light. Pearl could hear voices from the saloon below, men calling for another round, someone cursing about a bad hand. The sounds of Hart's world, the place where he belonged and she would always be an outsider. If I don't come back, then we'll manage without you. We've been managing without you for months. Hart stepped into the hallway, then turned back. Pearl. She waited, but he didn't finish whatever he'd started to say. Instead, he walked away, his footsteps echoing down the wooden stairs until they were swallowed by the noise from the saloon. Pearl locked the broken door as best she could and returned to the window. In the alley below, a drunk was trying to convince his horse to stand still long enough for him to mount. The horse kept sidling away, sensing its rider's condition, and the man kept stumbling after it in a dance that might have been funny under different circumstances. The baby woke with a thin cry that cut through Pearl's chest like a blade. She lifted her daughter from the crate, feeling how light she'd become, how fragile. The baby's eyes were the same whiskey color as her father's, but they held something Hart's eyes had lost, trust, hope, the belief that someone would take care of her. "It's all right, sweet girl." Pearl carried her daughter to the chair Hart had abandoned. "Mama's here." But as she unbuttoned her dress and felt how little milk she had left to give, Pearl wondered how long that promise would hold true. Outside, the drunk had finally managed to climb onto his horse, though he was facing backwards in the saddle. The horse, disgusted with the whole situation, began walking toward the street with its confused rider clinging to its tail. Pearl pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead and tasted salt, whether from tears or sweat she couldn't tell anymore. Chapter 4. Train leaves in 10 minutes, ma'am. Pearl adjusted the bundle in her arms, everything that remained of her life with Hart wrapped in a moth-eaten blanket. The conductor's brass buttons caught the morning sun as he consulted his pocket watch with practiced authority. "Which car?" She hoisted the canvas bag, containing her few possessions, higher on her shoulder. The strap cut into her flesh through the thin fabric of her dress. "Third class is in the rear, past the livestock." Pearl nodded and walked toward the back of the train, passing windows filled with well-dressed passengers reading newspapers and sipping coffee from china cups. A woman in a feathered hat glanced up as Pearl passed, her nose wrinkling as if she'd caught scent of something unpleasant. The third-class car smelled of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and something she couldn't identify but suspected was vomit. Pearl found an empty bench near a cracked window and settled her bundle beside her. Inside the blanket, her son whimpered, a sound so faint she might have imagined it. "How old is the little one?" Pearl looked up to find a Mexican woman watching her from across the aisle. Deep lines creased her brown face, and her hands were stained with what looked like laundry soap. 4 months. Pearl loosened the blanket to reveal the baby's face. His skin had a gray pallor that made her stomach clench with worry. "He needs a doctor. He needs his father to come home." Pearl wrapped the baby carefully. "But we can't always get what we need." The woman crossed herself. "Where are you bound?" "Colorado." "Trinidad." Pearl had picked the name from a newspaper advertisement promising work in the mining camps. The ad hadn't specified what kind of work, but she'd run out of options along with everything else. Mining towns are hard places for women alone. Harder than starving. The woman considered this, then reached into a cloth bag at her feet. She pulled out a small jar filled with dark liquid and held it across the aisle. "For the baby. My grandmother's recipe." She waited until Pearl took the jar. 3 drops on the tongue when he won't eat. More if he cries through the night. Pearl unscrewed the lid and sniffed. The contents smelled like herbs and something sharper, alcohol maybe or medicine. "What's in it?" "Things that help. Things that soothe." The woman's eyes were kind but tired. "Sometimes that's enough." The train lurched forward with a grinding of metal against metal. Pearl pressed her face to the window and watched Chicago's sooty buildings slide past, replaced gradually by farmland that stretched toward a horizon she couldn't see. Somewhere behind them, Hart was probably waking up in whatever bed he'd found after losing the cattle buyer's money. If he'd bothered to go home and found them gone, would he care enough to follow? Pearl touched the letter in her dress pocket, the one she'd left on the table beside the empty coffee tin. Short and to the point, like Hart preferred his conversations. "Gone west. Don't look for us. The baby and I will manage better alone." "You got people in Trinidad?" Pearl shook her head without turning from the window. "Just me and him. Mining camps got boarding houses. Some take women and children if you got coin." "How much coin?" "Depends on how desperate they are for tenants." The woman shifted in her seat as the train swayed around a curve. "Town like Trinidad, they're always desperate. Question is what you're willing to do to earn your keep." Pearl understood the implication. She'd heard the stories about women who followed the mining camps, trading whatever they had to trade for survival. The thought should have horrified her, but she felt nothing except a dull acceptance of possibilities she wouldn't have considered 6 months ago. What kind of work pays best? Cooking, cleaning, mending, if you got the skills. The woman paused. Other things pay better, but they cost more in the long run. The baby stirred in Pearl's arms, his breathing shallow and quick. She gave him 3 drops from the jar, watching as his tiny features relaxed slightly. Whatever the woman's grandmother had put in that mixture, it seemed to help. My name's Consuela. The woman leaned forward slightly. I've been back and forth to the mining camps for 10 years, following work. Got advice if you want it. I want it. Don't trust the first man offers you easy money. Don't drink water that ain't been boiled. Don't let nobody know you got any savings, even if it's just a few dollars. Consuela counted off points on her work-hardened fingers. And don't get too comfortable anywhere. Mining camps bust as quick as they boom. Pearl absorbed this information like a sponge soaking up water. Back in Lindsay, her mother had prepared her for parlor conversation and dinner parties. Hart had taught her about cards and dice and how to read a man's tells when he was bluffing. But nobody had taught her how to survive alone in a place where women were scarce and desperation was common currency. You got any trade skills? Pearl considered the question. She could play piano, speak French, and arrange flowers according to the principles her mother had drilled into her. She could also now identify the sound of Hart's footsteps in the hallway at 3 in the morning, and knew exactly how much laudanum would quiet a hungry baby without putting him to sleep permanently. I can cook. Some. She thought about the meals she'd stretched to last days when Hart's luck ran bad. I can make a little food go a long way. That's useful. What else? I can read and write. Do arithmetic. Pearl shifted the baby to her other arm. I can sew, though not fancy work. Reading's valuable in mining camps. A lot of men can't do it themselves, need letters read or written. Consuela nodded approvingly. That might keep you respectable, if that matters to you. Pearl looked down at her son's pale face. Respectability was a luxury she could no longer afford, but survival wasn't negotiable. How do I find work when I get there? Ask at the boarding houses first. They always need help. If that don't work, try the saloons. They need girls to serve drinks, keep the gamblers happy. Consuela's expression grew serious. But be careful who you work for. Some saloon owners treat their girls decent. Others. She didn't finish the sentence, but Pearl understood. She'd seen enough of Hart's world to know what happened to women who had no protection and no choices. The train began to slow as they approached a water stop. Through the window, Pearl could see a cluster of wooden buildings baking in the afternoon sun. A few people waited on the platform, men mostly, wearing the kind of work clothes that suggested hard labor and modest wages. Next stop's mine. Consuela gathered her belongings. Got a daughter in Pueblo, works in a boarding house there. Clean place, decent food, fair prices. She pressed a scrap of paper into Pearl's hand. Tell her Mama Consuela sent you. She'll help if she can. The train shuddered to a complete stop. Consuela stood, her joints creaking audibly, and made her way toward the door. Just before stepping down to the platform, she turned back. One more thing, girl. Whatever you end up doing to survive, don't let it change who you are inside. The world's hard enough on women without us forgetting our own worth. Pearl watched through the window as Consuela walked across the platform toward a man in overalls who swept her into a fierce embrace. The sight made something twist in Pearl's chest. Not jealousy exactly, but a recognition of what she'd lost and might never find again. The train lurched forward once more, carrying Pearl and her son toward Trinidad and whatever waited for them there. She gave the baby another dose of Consuela's medicine and settled back against the hard wooden seat as the landscape outside grew more desolate with each passing mile. Chapter 5. You cook half as good as you say you do. The job's yours. You lie. You're out on your ear before the stew gets cold. Understand? Pearl looked at the man, whose name was Sal. Just Sal. He had a belly that strained the buttons of his vest, and a face like a crumpled piece of butcher paper, all folds and shadows under the saloon's gaslights. The air in the place, the gilded garter, was thick enough to chew, a mix of stale beer, sweat, and the sweet cloying smell of cheap perfume. I understand, Pearl said, her voice steady. She held his gaze. Showing fear here would be like bleeding in a shark tank. Where's your kitchen? Sal grunted and hooked a thumb toward a swinging door behind the bar. Cleanest part of the whole damn establishment, which ain't saying much. Pots are there. Lard's in the tin. Got half a sack of potatoes and some onions that ain't yet turned. You find meat in the ice box. You let me know what kind it is before you cook it. Pearl pushed through the door. The kitchen was a closet with a stove. A single fly buzzed a lazy circle around a hanging coil of sticky paper already black with its brethren. Still, it was a stove. It was a chance. She found the potatoes and a knife that was surprisingly sharp. Her hands went to work, peeling the spuds with an economy of motion she hadn't known she possessed until necessity taught her. A woman came through the door, carrying a stack of dirty glasses. She was older than Pearl, with tired eyes and hair the color of faded straw. You're the new girl, the woman said. It wasn't a question. I'm the new cook, if I don't burn the water. Pearl didn't look up from her work. He hire you to sing, too? He doesn't know I can. The woman laughed, a dry rattling sound. Doesn't matter. Every girl who blows through Trinidad thinks she can sing. Name's Maeve. Pearl. She dropped peeled potatoes into a bucket of water. They hit with a dull splash. Sal's a bastard, but he's a fair bastard, Maeve said, starting to wash the glasses in a basin of murky water. He'll pay you what he says he will. But he won't protect you. You get that, right? A man gets handsy, that's your problem to solve. I've had practice solving it. Maeve looked at her then, a long appraising stare. She saw the faint yellowing of a bruise high on Pearl's cheekbone, the one she tried to hide with her hair. Maeve nodded slowly. Yeah. I figure you have. An hour later, the smell of beef and onion stew, rich and savory, had pushed its way out of the kitchen and was fighting a winning battle against the saloon's permanent stench. Miners coming off their shift stopped at the bar, sniffing the air. What's that, Sal? You hire a Frenchman? One of them called out. Sal came into the kitchen, a look of surprise on his crumpled face. He dipped a spoon into the pot, blew on it, and took a sip. He didn't say anything. He just took another, longer taste. Get some bowls, he said to Maeve. 50 cents a bowl. $1 with bread. He looked at Pearl. You're hired. You sleep in the attic room. 1 meal a day and $5 a week. And I sing, Pearl said. Sal stopped on his way out. What? I sing, she repeated. The piano player you've got now, he knows 3 songs and plays 2 of them wrong. I can do better. The hell you can. One night, Pearl pushed. Let me sing for one night. If the men don't buy more drinks when I'm on, I'll stick to the kitchen and never say another word about it. Sal stared at her, his little eyes calculating the odds. A singing cook. It was a novelty, if nothing else. Fine. One night. You cost me money, I'll take it out of your hide. That night, the gilded garter was full. The stew had sold out by 7. The long room was a sea of denim and flannel, rough men with coal dust still creased around their eyes, drinking away their pay. The piano player, a man named Silas with whiskey on his breath and sadness in his fingers, was plinking out a tune that sounded like a funeral march. Sal gave Pearl a nod. It was time. She walked from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her as she approached the small raised platform where Silas sat. She leaned down and whispered in his ear. He looked up, surprised, then shrugged and changed his tempo. Pearl didn't start with a rowdy drinking song. She started with something soft, a ballad about a girl waiting by the sea. Her voice wasn't powerful, but it was clear and true, and it cut through the noise like a clean blade. The chatter in the room faltered. A man in the middle of telling a joke stopped, his mouth open. Cards paused mid-deal. Men turned from the bar, mugs halfway to their lips, and looked toward the stage. She wasn't singing to them, not really. She was singing to their wives in Ohio, their sweethearts in Missouri, to the memory of a home that wasn't a mining camp bunkhouse. She was selling them a memory for the price of a whiskey. When the song ended, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then the room erupted. Whistles, stomping feet, men shouting for more. Pearl smiled, a real smile for the first time in months. She caught Sal's eye. He was pouring drinks as fast as he could, and he gave her another nod, this one holding a flicker of respect. Later, as she was serving a last round of coffee to the few sober men left, one of the miners cornered her by the kitchen door. He was big, with a beard that smelled of beer and bacon grease. He pressed a silver dollar into her hand. "That was mighty fine singing, miss," he said, his voice thick. "Mighty fine. I'd pay another $1 for a little private concert. Upstairs." His eyes weren't looking at her face. Pearl's hand closed around the coin. It was more than she'd make in a day. She could feel the weight of it, the cold promise of what it could buy. Milk. Medicine. A train ticket somewhere better. She looked at the man's hopeful, bleary eyes. She thought of Maeve's warning. "That's your problem to solve." "The only thing you'll get from me upstairs, mister," Pearl said, her voice low and even, "is a lesson in falling down them. Fast." The miner's face fell. He blinked, confused, then angry. "Well, hell, girl. No need to be like that." He snatched the dollar back from her hand and stomped away. Pearl watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd made a choice. For tonight, anyway. She finished her work long after midnight, after Maeve and Sal had gone to bed. The saloon was quiet, except for the groan of the floorboards and the drip of a leaky tap. She counted her tips from the night, 65 cents. Not a fortune, but it was hers. Earned with her voice and her wits, not her body. She walked over to the corner of the kitchen, where a floorboard had come loose near the icebox. She pried it up with the tip of her knife, revealing a small dark space beneath. She reached into her dress and pulled out the small jar of herbal medicine Consuela had given her on the train. It was nearly empty. She wrapped the coins in a scrap of cloth, placed them gently inside the jar, and set it carefully in the hollowed-out space before replacing the board and kicking a little dust over the seam. Chapter 6. Heard you was leaving. Pearl didn't look up from the letter she was writing at the end of the bar. She dipped the pen in the inkwell, the scratch of the nib on paper the only sound in the dead afternoon quiet of the saloon. She was writing to her mother, a letter full of careful lies. "The work is steady. The climate agrees with me. I am saving money. News travels fast in a town this small," Pearl said. Maeve wiped down the bar with a damp rag, her movements slow and methodical. "It travels faster when a man like Bartlett gets thrown out on his ear for trying to corner you in the pantry. Sal said you had a skillet in your hand. It was handy." The truth was, she'd grabbed it off the stove without thinking. It was still hot. Bartlett had a red, crescent-shaped mark on his cheekbone now, a brand of his stupidity. Sal had fired her an hour later. Not for hitting Bartlett, but for the trouble it would cause. A girl who fought back was bad for business. "Handy ain't the word for it," Maeve said, a small smile touching her lips. He won't be the last one, you know. You got a way about you. Men see it as a challenge. So I should go somewhere with no men. That'd be a convent, honey. And I don't see you in a habit. Maeve leaned on the bar, her voice dropping. Sal told me you asked about the stage south. To Arizona. Pearl finally looked up. Heard there's silver in Mammoth. There's silver everywhere, if you believe the flyers. There's also heat, snakes, and men a whole lot worse than Bartlett. Maeve's gaze was serious. Trinidad's hard, but it's a place you know. The desert, it don't forgive mistakes. Then I'll have to stop making them. Pearl folded the letter, sealed it with a drip of candle wax, and pushed a few coins across the bar. For the postage. The stagecoach ride was 3 days of purgatory. The heat baked the landscape to a uniform shade of brown. Dust seeped through the canvas flaps, coating Pearl's tongue and eyelashes with a fine grit. She sat beside a silent prospector who smelled of unwashed wool, and beside a woman in black bombazine who fanned herself with a Bible and muttered about Sodom and Gomorrah. Pearl said nothing. She watched the world outside the window change from the familiar green of the Colorado foothills to a brutal alien landscape of towering red rock and saguaro cactus that stood like silent, thorny men. She got off in Mammoth, a town that looked like it had been dropped from a great height and left where it landed. A single dusty street was flanked by a dozen sun-bleached wooden buildings. The heat was a physical thing. It pressed down on her, stole the air from her lungs. She had $7 left from her savings under the floorboard, a single change of clothes, and a reputation she'd left 1,000 miles behind her. The first 2 boarding houses turned her away. A woman alone was a woman looking for trouble. The third was a place called Cora's. It was set back from the main street, and the woman who answered the door had eyes that missed nothing and hair the color of a new penny. You looking for a room, or you looking for work? The woman asked. Her voice was like gravel rolling downhill. Whichever pays better, Pearl said. The woman, Cora, let out a short, sharp laugh. She looked Pearl up and down, from the worn-out boots to the determined set of her jaw. I like you. You got sand. Most girls get off that stage looking like wilted lettuce. You look like you're ready to bite someone. She opened the door wider. Room's $1 a day. You work for me, it's free. You'll do laundry, serve meals. And you'll keep your eyes open and your mouth shut. Can you do that? I can. Cora's was more than a boarding house. The men who stayed there were not minors. They were quiet men who came and went at odd hours, who paid in cash and never spoke of where they'd been or where they were going. They played cards in the parlor, the stakes quiet but high. Pearl served them whiskey and coffee, and she listened. She learned to tell a Texas accent from a Missouri one. She learned that a man who never looked you in the eye was either a liar or a lawman. Cora ran the place with an iron will. She was a banker, a confidant, and a fence for anything from a stolen watch to a pouch of high-grade ore. She saw something in Pearl, a sharpness that the other girls she hired lacked. You know cards? Cora asked one evening, watching Pearl clear away glasses from a table where a game had just broken up. Enough to keep from being cheated, Pearl said, quoting her father. That's the first step. Cora picked up the deck the men had left. Her hands were surprisingly nimble, her fingers shuffling the cards with a soft, whispering riffle. The second step is learning how to be the one doing the cheating. Pearl felt a cold knot in her stomach. This was different from singing in a saloon. This was a line she hadn't considered crossing. I'm not a thief, she said. Aren't you? Cora's eyes were sharp. What about the time you live on? The food you eat? You think the world just gives it to you? Everything's a trade, girl. Everything. You just gotta decide what you're willing to sell. A few weeks later, a man named Donovan checked in. He was a cattle buyer, he said, with a fat roll of bills and a loud laugh that didn't reach his eyes. He played poker every night, and he always seemed to win. The other men grumbled, but no one could catch him at whatever he was doing. "He's dealing from the bottom," Cora said to Pearl in the kitchen. "I've seen it twice now. He's good, but he's not invisible." "What are you going to do?" Pearl asked, scrubbing a pot. "I'm going to introduce him to my new girl." Cora took the pot from Pearl's hands. "You're going to sit in on the game tonight. You're not going to play. You're just going to serve the drinks. And you're going to watch his left thumb when he deals. That's all. Just watch." That night, Pearl felt the familiar weight of men's eyes on her as she moved around the parlor. But this time, it was different. She wasn't just a serving girl. She was a player in a different kind of game. She brought Donovan his whiskey, her fingers brushing his as she set it down, and she saw the flicker of interest in his eyes. She smiled, a slow, calculated smile she'd practiced in her small mirror. She took up a post near the wall, pretending to polish glasses, and she watched. For an hour, she saw nothing. Donovan's hands were a blur. Then just once, she saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible dip of his left thumb as he slid a card from the bottom of the deck. It was so fast, so smooth, that if Cora hadn't told her to look for it, she would have missed it completely. When the game broke up, and Pearl was heading up the back stairs to her room, Cora stopped her in the darkened hall. "Well?" "You were right," Pearl whispered, her heart thumping. "His thumb. It moves just before he deals to himself." Cora nodded, a grim satisfaction on her face. "Good. Tomorrow night, you're going to play. I'll stake you. When he deals, and you see him do it, you're going to spill your drink. All over his hands. Understand?" Pearl understood perfectly. It was a simple plan. An elegant one. And it was dishonest. It was a step into that shadowy world Cora lived in, a world of angles and schemes. She thought of her son, of the letters full of lies she sent to her mother. She thought of the $7 she had to her name. Cora was watching her, waiting for an answer. The house was silent around them, the air thick with the smell of stale smoke and secrets. Pearl took a breath, the hot desert air feeling cool in her lungs. She looked at the woman who was offering her a new kind of education, a new set of rules for survival. She gave a single, decisive nod. Chapter 7. Your deal, Donovan. The voice belonged to a rancher named Cale, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and whiskey. The parlor at Cora's was quiet, the air thick with smoke and the smell of money. Pearl held her cards, a worthless hand, but her cards didn't matter. Her whiskey glass, full and amber, sat on the small table at her elbow. Cora had staked her $20, a fortune that felt like a boulder in her pocket. Donovan gathered the cards, his movements a fluid, confident shuffle. Pearl's eyes were fixed on his left hand. She watched him talk, watched him laugh at a joke Cale made, but her focus was a tight, narrow beam on his thumb. The deal began. A card for Cale. A card for the prospector, Miller. A card for her. Then the second round. As he prepared to deal his own card, she saw it. The fractional dip. The barest whisper of a movement, as his thumb found the bottom of the deck. Pearl's arm jerked, a spasm she made look accidental. The whiskey glass tipped, arcing its contents across the table. The cold liquid splashed over Donovan's hands, soaking the cards, pooling on the green felt. "Oh!" Pearl gasped, jumping to her feet. "Clumsy me. I am so sorry." Donovan swore, snatching his hands back as if scalded. He was looking at the mess, at the ruined cards. But Cale and Miller were looking at the single card that had separated from the deck in the spill and landed face up, glistening with whiskey. The ace of spades. The room went dead silent. "Well now," Cale said, his voice dangerously soft. "That's a lucky card to have waiting on the bottom. Donovan's face went pale under his tan. His eyes, small and hard, flicked from the card to Pearl. There was no confusion in them. Only cold, murderous understanding. He knew. It was an accident, he snarled, pushing his chair back. Your whole damn winning streak's been an accident, Miller the prospector grumbled, emboldened by Cale's tone. Cora appeared in the doorway, as if summoned by the silence. Gentlemen, is there a problem? Donovan stood up, his hand dropping to the pistol holstered on his hip. No problem, Cora. Me and the little lady were just about to have a conversation. His eyes were locked on Pearl. Outside. Cora didn't even blink. From the folds of her dress, she produced a double-barreled Derringer. It looked like a toy, but no one in the room doubted it was real. Mr. Donovan, she said, her voice as calm as a Sunday sermon. Your credit here has expired. I suggest you cash out. Donovan hesitated, his gaze shifting from Pearl to the twin barrels of the Derringer. He looked back at Cale, who was now standing, his own hand resting on the butt of a Colt Peacemaker. He was outnumbered. He knew it. He snatched his hat from the rack, his face a mask of fury. This ain't over, he spat, the words aimed at Pearl. He stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Cora waited a beat, then tucked the Derringer away. Pearl. My office. Now. In the small, cluttered room behind the kitchen, Cora poured 2 glasses of brandy. She pushed one toward Pearl, whose hands were shaking so badly she had to grip the glass with both. You did good, girl. You got sand. He'll be waiting for me, Pearl said, her voice a whisper. Not if you ain't here to be waited for. Cora took a long sip of her brandy. Mammoth's played out for you. Donovan has a long memory and a short temper. You need to disappear. Go where? Back to Trinidad. Hell no. Cora shook her head. Going backwards is how you get buried. You're going forward. You're going to Phoenix. She slid a piece of paper across the desk. On it was an address. There's a woman there, runs a place on Block 41. Name's Hattie Briggs. You tell her Cora sent you. She'll put you to work. What kind of work? The kind you're good at. Paying attention. Cora leaned forward. Phoenix is a real city. Bigger stakes. Smarter men. And more of them. You learn to swim there, you can swim anywhere. The stage to Phoenix was hotter and dustier than the one that brought her to Mammoth. Pearl got off the coach and stepped into a wall of noise and people. Phoenix wasn't a camp. It was a sprawling, chaotic town on its way to being something more. Block 41 was easy to find. It was the part of town the polite people hurried past, a grid of saloons, dance halls, and cribs where women sat in open doorways like dolls on a shelf. Hattie Briggs's place was a 2-story brick building, cleaner than the others, with a piano playing inside that was actually in tune. Hattie herself was a tall, raw-boned woman with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to weigh and measure everything they saw. Cora sent you, she said, after Pearl had introduced herself. Cora, don't send me strays unless they're worth the trouble. Are you worth the trouble? I try not to be, Pearl said. Hattie grunted. That's the wrong answer. Trouble's how we make a living here. Come on. The inside was a parlor, much like Cora's, but bigger. A few women were scattered around the room. One, a sharp-faced brunette named Della, was cleaning her fingernails with a pocket knife. Another, a young Mexican girl with eyes like a frightened doe, sat at the piano, picking out a melody. That's Della, Hattie said, nodding at the brunette. She bites. The girl at the piano is Maria. She sings. You're going to watch. And you're going to learn. Pearl's education began that night. Hattie's was a high-class establishment, as far as such things went. The clients were cattle barons, politicians and bankers, men who wanted their secrets kept and their desires met with discretion. Pearl's job was to be invisible. She served drinks, emptied ashtrays, and listened. She learned to read the twitch in a man's eye that said he was bluffing, the sweat on his upper lip that said he was lying, the way his hand shook when he reached for his glass that said he was afraid. One afternoon, a week after she'd arrived, Hattie called her into the back room. Della was there, oiling a Colt .45. Hattie placed a smaller gun on the table. A Smith & Wesson safety hammerless, small enough to fit in a handbag. "Pick it up," Hattie said. Pearl hesitated, then lifted the pistol. It was heavier than it looked, cold and solid in her palm. "You ever fired one?" "No." "Della will teach you." Hattie looked at her, her expression unreadable. A woman in this business needs two things: a good memory for faces and a way to make sure she ain't forgotten. That little gun is for the second part. Della took her out back, to a yard filled with crates and barrels. She set up a line of bottles on a fence post. "It ain't a toy," Della said, her voice flat. She showed Pearl how to load it, how to grip it, how to aim. Point and shoot is for fools. You breathe out, you squeeze. Don't pull, don't jerk. Just squeeze. Pearl lifted the gun. Her arm trembled. The bottle seemed a mile away. She closed her eyes, breathed out, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening, the kick jarring her arm all the way to the shoulder. The bottle was untouched. "Again," Della said. They stayed out there for an hour. Pearl fired until her ears rang and her hand ached. She missed more than she hit, but by the end she'd shattered 2 of the 5 bottles. "It'll do," Della said, taking the gun back. "Just remember this. You pull that thing on a man, you better be ready to kill him. You hesitate, he'll take it off you and kill you with it. There ain't no in-between." That night, a cattleman flush with cash and whiskey got rough with Maria by the piano. He grabbed her arm, trying to pull her onto his lap. His friends laughed. Hattie was across the room, and Della was upstairs. The man was big, his face flushed. "Come on, little canary, sing me a song." Maria looked terrified. Pearl moved from behind the bar. She didn't have the gun. It was locked in Hattie's desk. She walked over, holding a full bottle of rye whiskey. "Sir," she said, her voice calm and low, "the lady doesn't want to sing right now." The cattleman turned, his eyes narrowing. "Who the hell are you?" "Her mother." "No, sir," Pearl said, placing the bottle of rye on the piano right beside his hand. "I'm the one who knows you've got a wife in Tucson, who thinks you're here buying breeding stock." The man froze. His hand dropped from Maria's arm. "And," Pearl continued, her voice dropping even lower, "I'm the one who knows the brand on your cattle ain't the one you were born with." The man's face went from red to white. He stared at her, his drunken bluster gone, replaced by a cold, sober fear. He hadn't even noticed her before, the quiet girl serving drinks. But she had noticed him. She'd listened to his bragging, pieced together the slips of his tongue, and filed it all away. Without another word, the cattleman threw a few bills on the table and walked out of the parlor, his friends scrambling to follow. Maria stared at Pearl, her eyes wide with awe. Della, who had appeared on the stairs halfway through, watched with a newfound respect. Pearl picked up the untouched bottle of rye whiskey from the piano and carried it back to the bar, her hand steady as a rock. Chapter 8. Dead as a Sunday morning. Della's voice was flat. She was sitting at the main poker table, idly shuffling a deck of cards. The cards made a soft, worn sound in the empty parlor. For 3 nights running, the only high roller at Hattie's had been the silence. "The silver's pinched out at the Grand," Pearl said, wiping down a clean glass for the 3rd time. "Heard it at the Mercantile. The foreman told his whole crew they were paid up, and wished them luck. Luck don't buy whiskey." Della snapped a card onto the felt table. Queen of Spades. And it sure as hell don't pay the rent. Hattie came out of the back room, an open ledger in her hands and a deep line etched between her brows. She didn't look at either of them. Her eyes were on the numbers that weren't adding up. We're switching to the rot gut from the barrel, not the bottles, Hattie said to the room at large. And water it down. If anyone complains, tell them it's a new supplier from back east. They'll complain, Della said. Let 'em. Hattie closed the ledger with a sigh that sounded like dust settling. A man who can still afford to be picky can afford to drink somewhere else. The bust hadn't happened all at once. It was a slow leak. It started with fewer men in the parlor, then men nursing one drink for 2 hours. Then it was the credit. Men who had always been good for it were suddenly asking Hattie to carry them for another week. The easy confidence of the town had evaporated with the silver, replaced by a quiet, watchful anxiety. Phoenix was a town built on a rumor of wealth, and the rumor was dying. Pearl felt it in the lightness of her pockets, in the cheap stew she now cooked for the house, made with more potatoes than meat. The small stash of money she kept in a loose brick behind her bed hadn't grown in a month. She'd become a part of this place, this unlikely family of women living on the edge of respectability. Now the edge was crumbling. A heavy knock at the front door made all three of them look up. It was too early for customers. Hattie straightened her spine. We ain't open. The door opened anyway. A man named Fletcher, who supplied Hattie with her liquor, stood there, his hat in his hands, but his face set like hard clay. Hattie, we need to talk about my bill. Your bill will be paid at the end of the month, same as always, Hattie said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Can't do it, Fletcher said, shaking his head. The freight company wants cash now. No credit. Which means I need cash from you. Now. Pearl watched Hattie's face. Not a muscle moved, but Pearl saw the slight tightening around her eyes. She'd seen that look on poker players holding a losing hand. How much? Hattie asked. Fletcher named a figure that made Pearl's stomach clench. It was more money than the house had likely seen in 2 weeks. Hattie disappeared into the back room. Pearl could hear the scrape of the heavy cash box, the clink of coins being counted. She came back out and pressed a stack of bills and a heavy cloth bag into Fletcher's hands. He counted it slowly, twice. It's all there, Hattie said, her voice cold. I know. Fletcher looked almost apologetic. Times are hard, Hattie. Times are always hard, Fletcher. Some of us are just better at hiding it. She closed the door behind him and leaned against it for a long moment. Della finally broke the silence. That the last of it? Close enough. Hattie pushed herself off the door and walked to the bar. She poured herself a drink from the good bottle, the one she kept for herself. Maria's cousin sent a letter from San Diego. Says there's work in the canneries. Pearl looked toward the piano, where Maria was usually picking out a sad, soft tune. The piano was silent. She's leaving? Tomorrow morning, Hattie said, downing the whiskey in one swallow. Can't say I blame her. This town is turning into a ghost, and I'm not planning on being the last one to haunt it. That afternoon, Pearl walked to the post office to mail another letter of lies to her mother. The wind had a new bite to it. Winter was coming. It wasn't the brutal, snow-choked winter of Ontario, but an Arizona winter had its own teeth. The nights would be cold enough to kill, and firewood, like everything else, cost money. She saw it everywhere she looked. The shuttered storefronts, the quiet knots of men standing on corners with nowhere to go, the wagons loaded with household goods heading out of town, not into it. When she got back to the house, a boy from the telegraph office was waiting on the porch. Got a wire for a Miss Pearl Taylor, he said, holding out the flimsy envelope. That'll be 50 cents. Pearl stared at him. No one knew her name was Taylor. Not here. She used a dozen different last names, whatever suited the moment. Fear, cold and sharp, went through her. Only her family knew that name. 50 cents was an extravagance. It was a meal. It was 2 meals. Who sent it? She asked, her voice tight. Don't know, ma'am. Just says it's from Lindsay, Ontario. The boy shifted his weight, impatient. Lindsay. The word hit her like a physical blow. She fumbled in her pocket, her fingers finding the few coins she had. She counted them out and gave them to the boy. He tipped his hat and ran off, leaving her alone on the porch with the envelope in her hand. Her fingers trembled as she tore it open. The message was brutally short, the clipped, impersonal language of the telegraph. Mother gravely ill. Stop. Doctor says, little time. Stop. Come home if you can. Stop. Father. She read it 3 times, the words blurring together. Gravely ill. Little time. The carefully constructed walls she had built around her past, around the girl she used to be, crumbled to dust. She saw her mother's face, not as the stern woman who demanded perfection, but as the woman who had once sung her to sleep. She walked back into the silent parlor, the telegram clutched in her hand. Della and Hattie looked up, saw her face, and knew something was wrong. Bad news? Hattie asked, her voice softer than Pearl had ever heard it. Pearl couldn't speak. She just nodded, sinking into a chair at the poker table. She laid the telegram down on the green felt. Come home if you can. If. The word was a canyon she couldn't cross. She thought of the cash box Hattie had just emptied. She thought of the few dollars hidden behind the brick in her room. It was nothing. Not nearly enough for a train ticket that would cost more than $100. Not nearly enough to cross the desert, the mountains, half a continent to get to a woman who was dying. She was trapped. The life she had built to survive had become her prison. The money was gone. The silver had run dry. And time was running out. Pearl stood up and walked to the wall where Hattie kept an old fly-specked map of the United States with the railroad lines marked in red. She found Arizona. She found Ontario. The distance looked impossible, a journey to another world. Beside the map was a framed train schedule. Her eyes scanned the columns of destinations and fares, the numbers mocking her. Phoenix to Chicago. Chicago to Toronto. Toronto to Lindsay. She stared at the numbers, her mind racing. There was no way. Not an honest way. The thought came to her, unbidden and unwelcome, but clear as a bell. An honest life had left her broke and helpless. She ran a finger along the red line, tracing the route of the Southern Pacific Railroad, her expression hardening into a mask of cold resolve. Chapter 9. A man could die of thirst, looking at a map like that. The voice came from the doorway. Pearl hadn't heard anyone come in. She turned from the wall, her hand dropping from the red railroad line she'd been tracing. A man stood there, holding a dusty hat. He wasn't one of Hattie's regulars. He looked like a miner, but his eyes were too still, too patient. They took in the empty room, Della asleep with her boots up on a poker table, and Pearl standing by the map like a woman looking for an escape route. The bar's closed, she said. Ain't looking for a drink. He stepped inside, his boots making a soft sound on the worn floorboards. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 30, with a lean frame that spoke of hard work and lean times. Name's Joe Boot. I was in here last week. You served me a whiskey. Pearl didn't remember him. She'd served 100 whiskeys last week. What do you want? To talk. He gestured with his hat toward the chair she'd been sitting in, the one with the telegram still lying on it. Saw the boy from the telegraph office leave your porch. You got the look of a woman who just heard the clock ticking. Pearl's hand instinctively went to the telegram, folding it, hiding the words. My business. Sure it is. He didn't press. He walked over to the bar and ran a finger through the dust. This whole town's business is drying up. The money's gone. Or going, anyway. I'm aware. Are you? He turned to face her, his expression serious. You're thinking the money's in the ground. The silver. But that ain't the only money in Arizona. There's money that moves. On wheels. A cold stillness settled over Pearl. She knew what he was talking about before he said another word. She'd heard the men in the parlor talk about it in low, speculative tones. Payrolls. Mine receipts. Wells Fargo boxes. I don't know what you mean, she said, her voice flat. I think you do. Joe Boot pulled a chair out from a table and sat down, straddling it, his arms resting on the back. He looked comfortable, like a man settling in for a long chat. A woman like you pay attention. You hear things. You know that stage that runs from Globe to Florence. Twice a week, regular as sunrise. Carries the payroll for the Silver King mine on the first and third Tuesday of every month. Della snorted in her sleep and shifted in her chair, then went still again. Pearl's heart was hammering a fast, frantic rhythm against her ribs. That's a dangerous conversation, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It's a practical one. His eyes were steady on hers. I seen you. The way you handle yourself. The way you handled that cattleman, the one who got fresh with the little singer. You didn't scream. You didn't run. You used your head. You found his weakness and you pushed, quiet-like. He was offering her a compliment and a criminal proposition in the same breath. She felt a flush of pride, followed by a chill of fear. I'm not a thief. No. He raised an eyebrow. What do you call living in a place like this? You take a man's money for a glass of watered-down whiskey and a sad song. You sell him a feeling, a memory of something he ain't got anymore. How's that different? It's not the same. The only difference is the amount of money and the amount of risk. He leaned forward slightly. I ain't talking about killing nobody. I'm talking about a business transaction. The company's insured. It's paper money to them. But to you, he glanced at the telegram in her hand. To you, it's a train ticket. It's time you can't get back any other way. He knew. He'd guessed it all. The dying mother, the impossible distance, the crushing weight of being broke and powerless. He was laying her own desperation out on the table and making it sound like a solution. You're insane, she said, but the words had no force behind them. Her mind was already racing, picturing it. A lonely road. A stagecoach. The surprise. The fear. The money. I'm a miner with no mine. You're a woman with no time. We're both just looking for a way out of a tight spot. He spoke as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world. It's a sure thing, Pearl. I know the route. I know the driver takes a piss at the same bend in the river every time. I know the guard they got on now is an old man who's more scared of his wife than he is of road agents. Her mind latched onto the practicalities, the details, because thinking about the details was easier than thinking about the morality of it. There'd be a posse that's got to track 2 people through 1,000 square miles of desert. We'd be ghosts before they even saddle up. And the money. We split it. Clean. 50-50. Enough for you to get on that train and have plenty left over. Enough for me to head down to Mexico and buy a little plot of land where no one knows my name. She sank back into her chair, the telegram feeling like a hot coal in her hand. She thought of her mother's face, the scent of lavender water she always wore. She thought of the life she'd run from, the gilded cage of her childhood. She had wanted adventure, a life of her own making. She had never imagined this. This was not adventure. This was the last resort of a cornered animal. "Why me?" she asked, the question genuine. "You could find any man with a gun to help you." A man gets greedy. A man gets drunk and talks. A man wants to be the hero of the story. Joe Boot shook his head. "You're different. You're not doing it for the thrill. You're doing it because you have to. That makes you reliable. That makes you smart." He stood up, putting his hat back on his head. He hadn't tried to charm her, hadn't tried to threaten her. He had simply laid out the facts as he saw them, a grim equation of risk and reward. "I ain't asking for an answer now," he said, his voice low. "You think on it. The next run is in 5 days. If you want to talk more, meet me at the livery stable tomorrow, sundown. If you don't show, I'll know your answer and you'll never see me again." He turned and walked to the door, his footsteps echoing in the big, empty room. He paused with his hand on the latch. "One more thing," he said without looking back. "They'll be looking for men. 2 men. They'll never be looking for a man and a woman." He stepped out into the harsh afternoon sun and was gone. Pearl sat in the silence, the hum of it loud in her ears. She looked at the telegram in her hand, the stark words, a death sentence for her mother and a prison sentence for her. She looked at the map on the wall, the impossible distance between Phoenix, Arizona, and Lindsay, Ontario. An honest life had left her broke and helpless. She unfolded the telegram one last time. "Come home if you can." Her eyes moved from the paper to the map. Her finger, smudged with dust from the bar, rose and began to trace a different route. Not the red line of the railroad, but a thin, nameless track that snaked its way through the mountains between Globe and Florence. Chapter 10. "I was beginning to think you weren't the punctual type." Joe Boot didn't look up when he spoke. He was sitting on an overturned bucket in the back of the livery, tightening a cinch on a saddle that had seen better decades. The air smelled of hay, horse sweat, and manure, a scent Pearl found strangely honest after the stale perfume of Hattie's parlor. Sundown bled through the gaps in the stable walls, striping the dusty floor in shades of orange and purple. "I had things to settle," Pearl said. She told Hattie she was taking a job cooking at a mining camp up north. A lie that felt flimsy and thin, but Hattie hadn't asked questions. She just pressed a $10 bill into Pearl's hand and said, "Don't spend it all in one place." Joe grunted and gave the cinch a final, firm tug. He stood and turned to her. In the dim light, his face was all shadows and angles. "Settled now?" "Enough." "Good." He nodded toward a horse blanket spread on the ground. On it lay a hand-drawn map, a shotgun, and a Colt revolver. "Welcome to the office." Pearl walked over and looked down at the display. The map was crude, just a charcoal sketch on a piece of tanned hide, but the details were precise. A winding line marked the road from Globe to Florence. A thicker line indicated a river. At a sharp bend, an X was drawn. "Right here," Joe said, tapping the X with his finger. "Cane Springs Wash. The road narrows, and the bank is steep on both sides. He has to slow the team to a walk to get through. And right before he does, there's a stand of cottonwoods. That's where the driver, a fella named Johnny Finger, stops to relieve himself. Every time. My old man used to say you could set your watch by a man's bladder." "And the guard?" Pearl asked, her eyes tracing the crude map. "Henry, or something like that. Pushing 65. He stays on the box, mostly asleep. He's there for show. The company saves money hiring old-timers." Joe's tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing crop prices. He picked up the Colt and held it out to her, but first. "You know how to use one of these?" "I've had lessons." She took the gun. It was heavier than the little Smith & Wesson Hattie had given her, more solid, more serious. "Lessons ain't the same as doing. He watched her check the cylinder, his eyes sharp. You won't have to fire it. You probably shouldn't. Just have to hold it steady. A gun in a woman's hand, it makes a man nervous. A gun in a man's hand, that's just Tuesday. But you won't be a woman. He moved to a saddlebag hanging from a stall door and pulled out a bundle of clothes. He tossed them onto the blanket. A pair of denim trousers worn soft at the knees. A flannel shirt faded from the sun. A dusty felt hat with a wide brim. Your new dress, he said. You're my partner. A young fella, maybe a little green. Name of Bill. You don't talk much. You just hold the gun and look mean. Pearl picked up the trousers. The rough fabric felt alien in her hands. She thought of the silk dresses her mother had insisted upon, the corsets that had pinched her waist. This was a different kind of uniform, for a different kind of life. What do I do with my hair? She asked. It was long, thick, the one vanity she had left. She usually wore it pinned up, but it would be impossible to hide under the hat. Joe pulled a long, wicked-looking knife from a sheath on his belt. He tested the edge with his thumb. You cut it. The finality of the words hung in the air between them. This wasn't just a disguise. It was a shedding of a skin. He wasn't asking her, he was telling her what was necessary. Let's talk through it first, she said, stalling. Joe nodded, seeming to understand. All right. We ride out tomorrow night, make a cold camp. We're in place before dawn on Tuesday. We wait. When we hear the stage, you take the horses back in the brush. I step out into the road. The driver, Finger, he'll see the shotgun and he'll reach for the sky. The old man might make a fuss, but he won't draw. I'll get them to throw down the box. That's all we want. The Wells Fargo box. What if there are passengers? Passengers do what they're told. They're just trying to get where they're going. This ain't their fight. What if the guard isn't asleep? What if he's not an old man this time? Then I'll have to get his attention. Joe patted the stock of the shotgun. But he will be. The company's losing money. They ain't spending it on top-shelf guards for a route that hasn't been hit in 10 years. He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. You're looking for the holes. That's smart. But at some point, you gotta stop looking and just do. You trust your plan, you trust your partner, and you don't get greedy. He picked up the Colt again. Let's see your lessons. He took her to the far end of the stable, where the back door opened onto a dry, scrub-filled patch of land. He stuck an empty bottle on a fence post 50 feet away. Show me, he said. Pearl raised the pistol, her arm feeling heavy and clumsy. She sighted down the barrel. The bottle seemed to dance in the fading light. She remembered Della's voice. Breathe out, you squeeze. She fired. The recoil slammed her wrist, and the shot kicked up dust a good 5 feet to the left of the bottle. You're pulling it, Joe said, his voice calm. And you're closing your eyes right before you shoot. Keep 'em open. See where it goes. She tried again. This time, the shot was high. Again. She fired 4 more times, emptying the cylinder. None of the shots came close. Frustration, hot and sharp, rose in her throat. I can't do it, she said, lowering the gun. I didn't ask you to shoot a fly off its back, Joe said. He reloaded the pistol and handed it back to her. I just need you to look like you can. Stand here. He positioned her, turning her body slightly, adjusting her grip. Now, you point that at a man's belly from 10 feet away. He ain't gonna ask for your marksmanship certificate. He's just gonna see the hole at the end of the barrel. That's all that matters. They went back inside the stable as true darkness fell. The horses shifted in their stalls, their breath misting in the cooling air. Joe lit a lantern, its yellow light pushing back the shadows. Pearl stood by the horse blanket, looking at the men's clothing, the gun, the map. It was all real now. Not just a desperate idea in a quiet parlor, but a collection of tools for a dangerous job. Her mother's face swam in her memory, pale and sick. "Come home if you can." She picked up the knife Joe had laid on the blanket. The steel was cold against her palm. She gathered her long hair in her left hand, pulling the thick rope of it over her shoulder. She didn't hesitate. She didn't close her eyes. She sawed at the hair just below her jawline, the blade snagging and pulling. It was a rough, ragged cut. Hunks of dark hair fell to the dusty floor. When she was done, she was left with a short, jagged mane that brushed her collar. She looked different. She felt different. Lighter. Colder. Joe watched the whole thing without saying a word. When she was finished, he simply nodded, as if she'd just passed the final part of a test. He picked up the dusty felt hat and handed it to her. "Try that on, Bill," he said. Chapter 11. Sun's getting high. Joe's voice was a low rumble, barely disturbing the morning's heat-soaked silence. He lay on his belly behind a scree of rock, the long barrel of the shotgun resting on the stone in front of him. Pearl crouched beside him, the dusty felt hat pulled low, its brim scratching her forehead. The short, ragged ends of her hair were already damp with sweat. "He'll be here," she said. Her own voice sounded strange to her, a hoarse imitation of the boy named Bill she was supposed to be. Her mouth tasted like copper. "He'd better be." Joe shifted his weight, the movement sending a small cascade of pebbles down the rock face. "My bladder's starting to sympathize with his." Pearl didn't answer. She was listening. For the past hour, she'd been listening to the buzz of insects, the rustle of a lizard in the dry brush, the thumping of her own heart against her ribs. She held the Colt in her lap, her knuckles white where she gripped it. It didn't feel like a tool anymore. It felt like a verdict. Then she heard it. Faint at first, a rhythmic creak and jingle carried on the still air. Joe heard it too. He tensed, every line of his body going rigid. "That's him. Get the horses." Pearl scrambled back from the ledge, her boots slipping on the loose rock. The two horses were tethered in the shade of the cottonwoods, their heads low, tails flicking at flies. She untied the reins, her fingers feeling thick and clumsy. The jingle of the approaching harness was louder now, accompanied by the rumble of heavy wheels and the high, off-key whistle of a man with nothing on his mind. She led the horses deeper into the wash, pressing herself against the warm flank of her mare as the stagecoach came into view. It was a standard Concorde, its red paint faded and peeling, caked with the dust of 100 identical trips. A man with a sunburnt face and a drooping mustache held the reins. Johnny Finger. Beside him, a stooped figure in a dusty coat held a rifle across his lap. The guard. He looked even older than Joe had promised. Just as the map had shown, the coach slowed to a walk to navigate the narrow turn. And just as Joe had predicted, Johnny Finger pulled the team to a halt right beside the cottonwoods. "Hold 'em steady, Henry," the driver called out, wrapping the reins around the brake handle. "Nature calls." He hopped down from the box and ambled toward the trees, unbuttoning his trousers. This was it. Joe stepped out from behind the rocks. He moved with a lazy, deliberate slowness that was more menacing than any sudden rush. He held the shotgun low, cradled in the crook of his arm. "I'd hold that thought if I were you, Johnny," Joe said, his voice calm and even. Johnny Finger froze, his hands fumbling at his belt. His head snapped around, his eyes going wide. The guard, Henry, jerked awake on the box, fumbling to bring his rifle around. "Don't," Joe said, the single word cracking like a whip. He didn't raise the shotgun, but he didn't have to. The old man's hands went up, the rifle clattering on the floorboards. All right, Johnny Finger said, his hands in the air. "No trouble here." "That's what I like to hear." Joe nodded his head toward the coach. "The box. Throw it down." Nice and easy." The driver and the guard exchanged a look. The guard gave a tiny, defeated shrug. Together, they wrestled the heavy, iron-strapped Wells Fargo box from under the seat and shoved it over the side. It landed in the dust with a solid, satisfying thud. The plan had worked. It was that simple. Pearl's mind screamed at Joe, "Get the box and let's go. Get it and run." But Joe didn't move. He was looking past the driver, at the coach's windows. A pale face peered out, then vanished. "Don't get greedy," he had told her. She saw the lie of it now. Greed was a fever, and he had it. "All right, folks," Joe called out, his voice taking on a new edge, a showman's swagger. "Show's not over. Everybody, out. Let's see what you got." This wasn't the plan. Pearl's blood went cold. This was a mistake. This was more time. More risk. The coach door creaked open. A portly man in a drummer's suit and bowler hat stepped out, his face the color of putty. He was followed by a stern-faced woman in a black traveling dress, who clutched a beaded reticule to her chest. Finally, a young Chinese man in a simple tunic and trousers emerged, his eyes downcast. "Wallets, watches, and shiny things on the ground," Joe said, gesturing with the shotgun. "You, Bill. Get over here and watch our friends on the box." Pearl's feet felt like lead, but she moved, forcing herself out of the trees and into the stark sunlight. She pulled the brim of her hat down, keeping her face in shadow, and leveled the Colt at the two men on the driver's box. They stared at the gun, then at her slight frame. She could feel their eyes trying to piece together the boy named Bill. The drummer was fumbling with his watch chain. "Now see here, this is an outrage." "It's a robbery," Joe cut him off. "The outrage comes later, when you tell the story. Now drop it." The watch clattered in the dust. The Chinese man quietly placed a small, worn leather pouch on the ground. The woman in black, however, stood ramrod straight, her lips a thin, disapproving line. She looked from Joe's shotgun to the Colt in Pearl's hand. Her eyes, cold and gray, met Pearl's for a split second. In that moment, the world fell away. The heat, the dust, the fear, it all vanished. Pearl saw herself through this woman's eyes. She wasn't a desperate daughter trying to get home. She wasn't a clever woman playing a part. She was a figure in a dusty road with a gun, a highwayman, a terror in the daylight. The woman's gaze held no fear. Only a deep, bottomless contempt. It was the same look her own mother had given her the day she'd announced she was marrying Hart. Pearl felt the world snap back into place as the woman finally tossed her reticule onto the growing pile. "Get the damn box, Bill," Joe barked, scooping the valuables into a canvas sack. Pearl tore her eyes away from the woman and moved toward the Wells Fargo box. It was heavier than she'd imagined. She hooked her fingers under the iron straps, her muscles straining. This was it. This was the price of a train ticket. This was the cost of her mother's life. As she dragged the box toward the horses, she heard the drummer's voice, high and reedy with indignation. "You won't get away with this. Sheriff's only a few hours behind us." Joe laughed. "A few hours in this country is a lifetime." He turned back to the passengers. "Now, unless anyone else wants to be a hero." He let the sentence hang in the air. No one moved. "Get on your horse," Joe yelled at Pearl. She dropped the box and scrambled into the saddle, her hands shaking. Joe backed away from the stagecoach, the shotgun still leveled, his sack of loot slung over his shoulder. He swung onto his own horse, never taking his eyes off the small, terrified group. "It's been a pleasure doing business with you folks," he said, a grin splitting his face. He kicked his horse, and the animal lunged forward. Pearl followed suit, digging her heels into her mare's flanks. They galloped past the stagecoach, past the frozen figures of their victims, and into the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the desert. The last thing Pearl heard was the woman in black shouting after them, her voice clear and ringing with fury. God will see you punished. Pearl bent low over her horse's neck, the hot wind tearing at her face, and spurred the animal faster. Chapter 12. This is far enough. Joe pulled his horse to a stop in the meager shade of a rock outcropping that looked like a melted candle. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the baked earth. Pearl reined in beside him, sliding from the saddle. Her legs felt like they were filled with sand, and when her boots hit the ground, the heat came right through the worn leather soles. Far enough for what? She asked, her voice a dry rasp. They had been riding for hours, a frantic, dust-choked gallop that had slowed to a grim, plodding walk. Far enough to count the till. A grin cracked the dust on Joe's face. He swung down and immediately went to the pack horse, unlashing the ropes that held the Wells Fargo box. It slid to the ground with a heavy, final thud. Pearl went to her horse's head, pulling the canteen from her saddle horn. The water was hot enough to make tea, but she drank anyway, swishing the lukewarm liquid in her mouth before swallowing. We should keep moving. Put more distance. Distance from what? Joe scoffed, pulling a crowbar from his saddle roll. A fat sheriff in a buckboard? By the time they get a posse together, we'll be halfway to Mexico. He knelt beside the box. This is the important part. Pearl watched him, the anger that had been simmering since the robbery finally boiling over. The plan was the box. Just the box. What was that back there with the passengers? Joe didn't look up. He jammed the tip of the crowbar into the seam of the box's lid. A bonus. A little something for our trouble. You don't leave money on the table. You leave time on the table, she shot back. You gave them 5 more minutes to remember your face. You gave that woman a reason to preach a sermon to the sheriff. The image of the woman's contemptuous eyes was burned into her mind. God will see you punished. What's a drummer's watch and a few wallets? Joe grunted, putting his weight on the crowbar. The iron groaned, but the lock held. They'll be talking about the box, not the pocket change. They'll be talking about us. About the 2 men who held them up. They'll remember the sound of your voice. They'll remember how tall I am. She ran a hand through her shorn, ragged hair. It was a mistake. The only mistake would be leaving this here unopened. He repositioned the crowbar, sweat dripping from his nose onto the hot metal of the box. He heaved again. A loud crack echoed in the silence, but it was the wood of the crowbar handle, not the lock. Joe swore and threw it down. Damn thing's built like a bank vault. It's supposed to be. Pearl looked around at the landscape. It was a garden of thorns and rocks, all shimmering under the relentless sun. In every direction, the horizon was the same jagged line of distant, indifferent mountains. Where are we, Joe? On our way. That's not an answer. She walked to his side, her shadow falling over the hand-drawn map he'd pulled from his pocket. Show me. He hesitated, then spread the map on the ground. It looked different out here, less a guide than a hopeful guess. We're here, he said, stabbing a finger at a spot in a vast empty space between 2 crudely drawn landmarks. We follow this dry wash north. It'll take us to the Gila River by morning. Pearl looked from the map to the sun. It was hanging in the west, a little lower than it should be. The sun's at our back. We've been riding west, not north. The wash curves, he said, his voice sharp with irritation. I know this country. But she could see it in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty he couldn't hide. He'd been so sure of himself during the robbery, so full of swagger. Out here with no one to perform for, the swagger was gone, replaced by a brittle confidence that cracked under the slightest pressure. How much water have we got? She asked. He shrugged, gesturing to the canteens on the saddles. Enough. Pearl walked from horse to horse, uncorking each canteen, lifting it, feeling its weight. Her own was half full. Joe's was about the same. The one on the pack horse was nearly empty. "No, Joe," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "We don't have enough. Not if the Gila River isn't where you think it is." "It's where I think it is." He stood up, kicking at the stubborn lockbox in frustration. "This thing is slowing us down. It's the only reason we're out here. What good is it if we can't get it open?" He paced back and forth, a caged animal in a cage of his own making. "We should bury it. Come back for it later." "With what map?" Pearl shot back. "And what posse on our heels? We take it with us." The argument died, unresolved, leaving a tense, bitter silence. The sun dipped lower, painting the rocks in lurid shades of orange and red. The heat began to recede, but the chill that replaced it was no more comforting. They were two specks in an immense and hostile world, tied together by a crime and a heavy locked box. They made a cold camp, chewing on hard biscuits that turned to dust in their mouths. They drank sparingly, each mouthful of water a treasure they couldn't afford to spend. Joe worked on the box again with the broken crowbar and a rock, his grunts and curses the only sounds in the twilight. Pearl took the Colt, walked a short distance away, and practiced aiming at a saguaro cactus, its arms raised to the sky like a silent witness. She didn't fire. She just practiced holding it steady, getting the feel of its deadly weight until the last light failed. She lay on her blanket, staring up at a sky so thick with stars it was dizzying. She had never felt so small, so utterly alone. She thought of her mother, lying in a sickbed 1,000 miles away. Every hour they spent lost in this desert was an hour her mother might not have. Later, when the moon was high, and Joe's breathing had settled into the deep rhythm of sleep, Pearl sat up. She crept over to the saddles and gathered the canteens. She poured all the remaining water into one, so she would know exactly how much they had left. It barely filled half of it. She stood for a long time, the single canteen in her hand, the cool desert air raising goosebumps on her arms. Joe had been her guide, her partner, her way out. Now, she wasn't so sure what he was. She looked at him, a dark shape huddled by a useless box of money. She looked at the unforgiving landscape around them. She had trusted him. That was her mistake. She wouldn't make it again. She took a small, careful sip of their shared water and screwed the cap on tight. Chapter 13. One of them was a boy. Couldn't have been more than 17. Sheriff Truman shifted his considerable weight in his office chair, which protested with a loud groan. He looked at Johnny Finger, the stagecoach driver who was nursing a cup of coffee that was mostly whiskey. "A boy, you say? Not a man." "Felt like a boy," Johnny insisted. "Slight. Didn't say a word, but the way he held that pistol, it was all wrong. Like he was scared of it." Across the room, the woman in black, whose name was Mrs. Elias Pethbridge, made a sound of disgust. He was not a boy. He was a coward. They were both cowards, hiding behind guns. She had refused coffee, refused a chair, and had been standing by the window for an hour, as rigid and unyielding as a fence post. Truman sighed and turned his attention to the man sitting quietly in the corner, a Pima tracker named Miguel. Miguel hadn't said a word, but he had listened to everyone. "What do you make of it, Miguel?" the sheriff asked. Miguel's dark eyes moved from the driver to Mrs. Pethbridge. "A man who is scared of his gun is more dangerous than a man who is not. And a woman who is not scared of anything is the most dangerous of all." He looked pointedly at Mrs. Pethbridge, who met his gaze without flinching. "They took my late husband's timepiece," she said, as if that were the final damning piece of evidence. "And a Wells Fargo box with $4,000 in it," Truman added, rubbing his temples. The telegram from the company office in Tucson had been emphatic. "The money's the thing. The rest is just noise." A young deputy, barely old enough to grow the mustache he was so proud of, burst in. "Got the horses shod, Sheriff. And Mr. Egan from the newspaper is here." Wants to know if you have a statement. Tell Mr. Egan I'll make a statement when I've got something to state, Truman grumbled. Get the pack mules ready. Extra water. Miguel, you'll need a fresh mount. The tracker nodded. They have a pack horse. It will slow them. They will look for water, but they will not find it where they think. How do you know that? The deputy asked, his voice full of youthful skepticism. Miguel's expression didn't change. Because they are Easterners. Or they think like them. They believe a line on a map is the same as the land. The land does not curve where their map says it does. The water's gone. Pearl's voice was flat, devoid of accusation. It was a simple statement of a catastrophic fact. She held the empty canteen upside down, a single drop of water catching the morning sun before sizzling on the hot rock. Joe stared at the canteen, then at her. His eyes were bloodshot, his lips cracked and peeling. The swagger was a distant memory. The man who stood before her was just a thirsty animal. You drank it, he said, his voice a low growl. We drank it, she corrected him. Last night. There wasn't enough to begin with. Your plan, your map, your shortcuts. This is on you. My plan was to be in Mexico by now, drinking tequila. He kicked the heavy lockbox, his boot thudding uselessly against the iron straps. This thing, it's an anchor. We should have left it. And had what? A stolen watch and a story to tell. Pearl looked west, toward the shimmering line of mountains that seemed to get farther away the more they walked. They'd abandoned their horses at dawn. The animals were spent, their heads hanging, their ribs showing. Leading them had become more effort than riding them. We need to find the river. I told you, the wash leads to the river. The wash led us here, she said, gesturing to the box canyon they'd stumbled into, a dead end of sheer rock walls. Your wash betrayed you, Joe. Now you need a new idea. He stared at her, his face a mask of fury and thirst. For a moment, she thought he might hit her. She stood her ground, her hand resting on the butt of the Colt tucked into her trousers. The power had shifted completely. He had the muscle, but she had the last of the biscuits and the only clear head between them. We climb, she said, pointing to a fissure in the rock face, a steep, treacherous path of loose shale and sun-baked stone. We get to high ground. We see what there is to see. And the box, he demanded, his voice cracking. The box stays here. We can't carry it. We can't drink it. It's worthless to us right now. No. The word was absolute. He stood over the box, his arms spread, a king defending a worthless, heavy throne. We don't leave the money. Then you'll die here with it, Pearl said, and turned her back on him. She walked to the rock face and began to climb. Miguel knelt, his long fingers tracing a pattern in the dust. Sheriff Truman and the deputy watched from their saddles. They'd been riding for a day and a half, following a trail that only the Pimas seemed to see. They camped here, Miguel said, pointing to the faint scuff marks where Pearl and Joe had laid their blankets. He picked something up, a small dark object, and held it in his palm. It was a ragged clump of dark brown hair. What's that? The deputy asked. A haircut, Miguel said. He looked toward the west. One of them is not who he seems. He walked a few paces and pointed to the ground again. And they are arguing. How in the hell can you tell that? Truman asked, mopping his brow with a bandana. The tracks are deep. Angry. Miguel stood and scanned the horizon. They left their horses here. He pointed to where the three animals stood, listless, their reins trailing in the dust. One of them was the pack horse, its back raw from the weight of the box. But they took the saddles and the guns. So they're on foot? The deputy said, a note of excitement in his voice. We've got them. You have them when they're in chains, Miguel corrected him, his voice soft. The desert has them now. And she is in no hurry to give them up. He found the scuff marks where Pearl had dragged the box, then the deeper tracks where Joe had carried it. They are still carrying the money. It will make them slow. It will make them stupid. He found something else, half buried in the sand near where the passengers' valuables had been sorted. It was a small, lace-edged handkerchief, embroidered with a single initial. A P. It smelled faintly of lavender. Miguel looked at the delicate piece of fabric, then at the rough tracks leading into the Devil's Garden. He tucked the handkerchief into his pocket without a word. Pearl reached the top of the ridge, her lungs burning, her hands scraped raw from the climb. The world spread out below her, a vast panorama of brown and red. And there, to the north, a thin, shimmering green line. The Gila River. It was miles away, a full day's walk at least, but it was there. It was real. Hope, fierce and painful, surged through her. She turned to shout down to Joe, to tell him what she'd found. But Joe was no longer at the bottom of the canyon. He was halfway up the fissure, the heavy Wells Fargo box somehow strapped to his back with their saddle cinches. He was moving with a lunatic strength, his face a purple mask of exertion, his eyes wild. He was not going to leave the money. He was going to carry it to the river, or he was going to die under its weight. Pearl watched him, a new kind of fear taking hold. She wasn't just lost with a fool anymore. She was trapped with a madman. She looked from the distant, life-giving river to the man struggling up the cliff with his treasure. The posse behind them suddenly seemed like the lesser of two evils. She scrambled down a few feet to a wider ledge, her eyes scanning the back trail. She saw nothing but heat, shimmer, and rock. But she knew they were there. She could feel them, a slow, patient tide following the tracks of their desperation. She pulled the Colt from her belt, the metal hot against her skin, and waited. Chapter 14. Leave it, Joe. For God's sake, just leave it. Pearl's voice was a dry crackle, lost in the vastness. She watched him from the ledge, a monster crawling up the face of the cliff. He was on his hands and knees now, the Wells Fargo box a grotesque turtle shell on his back, dragging him down. He didn't seem to hear her. The only sound was his own ragged, animal breathing and the scrape of the box against stone. She looked north again, at the impossible green line of the river. It might as well have been the moon. Then she looked back the way they had come. The heat shimmer was a curtain, but she knew what was behind it. Men. Horses. Water. Joe's hand appeared over the edge of the ledge, scrabbling for a hold, his knuckles white and bloody. He hauled himself up, the muscles in his neck standing out like ropes. He collapsed onto the rock, the box pinning him to the ground. He lay there, chest heaving, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at the unforgiving blue sky. "We saw it," he wheezed, a trickle of bloody spittle on his lips. "The river." "I saw it," Pearl corrected him. "You saw a box full of money." She stood over him, the Colt hanging heavy in her hand. "We're not going to make it there. Not with that. We have to." He struggled to get his arms under him, to push himself up, but the weight was too much. "The money. The money is a tombstone, Joe. And you're trying to carry it to your own grave." She saw a flicker of the old Joe in his eyes then, a spark of cunning and anger. "You want to leave it. Leave me. Take your chances with the posse." "The posse has water," she said, the words tasting like a confession. "What do you have? A $4,000 thirst?" "It's my stake." He was talking to himself now, his voice a delirious mumble. "A man's got to have a stake. Down in Mexico, a little place." Pearl turned away from him. It was like talking to a ghost. She scanned the back trail again, her eyes straining. And then she saw them. Not men, not yet. Just dust. A small, patient plume of dust rising against the distant red rocks, moving steadily in their direction. They were coming. A frantic energy seized her. She could run. She could scramble down the other side of the ridge, make for the river alone. It was a chance. A slim one, but it was a chance. She took a step, then another. "Don't you do it." Joe's voice was a venomous hiss. She turned back. He had managed to unstrap the box and was on his knees. He had his own pistol out, the barrel wavering in his unsteady hand. "Don't you walk away from this," he snarled. "We're partners." "We stopped being partners when you decided to rob the passengers," she said, her own gun coming up, the movement fluid and sure. They faced each other on the narrow ledge, two scarecrows armed for a battle that was already lost. "The partnership is dissolved, Joe." His laugh was a dry, rattling cough. "You think they'll see a difference? A man with a gun, a boy with a gun. We hang together." The dust cloud was closer now. She could almost make out the shapes of riders. Time had run out. All the choices she had made, leaving Lindsay, following Hart, taking up with Joe, had led her to this sun-blasted ledge, to this final pointless standoff. And then she saw him. A single rider, detached from the main group, sitting on his horse at the base of the cliff, looking up at them. He wasn't wearing a badge. He was just watching them, patient as a vulture. The Pima tracker. Miguel. He had found them. The fight went out of her. It drained away like water into sand, leaving behind a hollow, bitter calm. She lowered the Colt. "They're here," she said. Joe's eyes followed her gaze. He saw the rider, then the larger group of men fanning out below. His face crumpled, the madness giving way to a raw, childlike despair. "No," he whispered. "No. Not yet." The posse didn't charge. They didn't shout. They simply took up positions, their rifles glinting in the sun. A big man with a sheriff's star on his vest dismounted and looked up at them through a spyglass. "You've had a hard run, folks," the sheriff's voice boomed, echoing off the rocks. "No need to make it harder. Throw the guns down." Joe scrambled back to the Wells Fargo box, his hands clutching at it as if he could shield himself with the money. "They won't take it. They won't take my stake." Pearl looked at the Colt in her hand. She thought of Della's words. "You pull that thing on a man, you better be ready to kill him." She looked at the men below. She wasn't ready to kill any of them. And she wasn't ready to die on this rock. Not for Joe. Not for the box. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed the pistol. It spun through the air, end over end, before clattering onto the rocks 20 feet below. "It's over, Joe," she said. His head snapped toward her, his face a mask of betrayal. He raised his own pistol, but his eyes weren't looking at the posse. They were looking at her. Before he could decide what to do, a rifle shot cracked from below. It wasn't aimed at him. It was aimed at the rock just above his head, sending a shower of stone chips into his face. He cried out, dropping the gun, his hands flying to his eyes. 2 deputies started up the fissure, moving with a practiced, steady confidence. Pearl sat down on the hot rock, her back against a boulder, and waited. It took them 10 minutes to reach the ledge. Joe was curled on the ground, weeping. The deputies ignored him. They walked over to Pearl, their faces grim, their rifles held ready. "On your feet, son," one of them said. She stood up slowly, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The deputy grabbed her arms and spun her around, pushing her face against the rock. The stone was hot and rough against her cheek. She felt the cold, heavy bite of handcuffs closing around her wrists. They led her down the cliff face. When she reached the bottom, the big sheriff was waiting for her. He looked her up and down, taking in the ragged haircut, the boy's clothes, the dirt and exhaustion. "You led us a hell of a chase, kid," Sheriff Truman said. He gestured to a canteen on his saddle. "You look like you could use a drink." A deputy uncorked it and handed it to her. Pearl drank, the water tasting sweeter than anything she had ever known. She drank, until the deputy took the canteen away. The Pima tracker, Miguel, walked over. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her hands, cuffed behind her back. Then he looked at her boots, which were scuffed and too big for her feet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, lace-edged handkerchief. It was embroidered with the letter P. He held it out, not to her, but to the sheriff. Truman took the handkerchief and looked at it. He looked at Pearl's face, really looked at it this time, past the grime and the short hair. He saw the line of her jaw, the shape of her eyes. A slow, dawning comprehension spread across his face. "Well, I'll be damned," the sheriff said, his voice a mixture of surprise and something that might have been grudging respect. "It's not a boy at all." Pearl met his gaze, her head held high. She didn't say a word. She just watched his eyes as he began to understand just who and what he had captured. Chapter 15. You got more visitors than the governor. The deputy, a young man named Carlyle with a face full of freckles, slid a tin plate through the bars. It held a piece of cornbread and a lump of something that might have been beans. He didn't move away. He lingered, watching her, his eyes wide with a kind of gawking admiration. "They're not visitors," Pearl said, her voice still raw from thirst and dust. "They're spectators." She picked at the cornbread. Her wrists were raw from the handcuffs, but the iron was gone, replaced by the four walls of the Tucson jail cell. "Call 'em what you want," Carlyle said. "There's a fella from the Citizen out there, another one from the Star. They're drawing pictures of you. Heard a man from as far as San Francisco is on his way." Pearl looked past him, through the barred window of the sheriff's office. She could see them, a small crowd of men in dusty suits, scribbling in notepads, their faces turned toward her cell block. Now and then, a bright, startling flash of magnesium powder would light up the street, followed by a puff of white smoke. They were taking photographs of the building that held her. "What about Joe?" she asked. The deputy shrugged. "Other fella? He's down the end. Ain't talking. Just sits there staring at the wall." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Is it true you held that gun on him yourself? That you were the brains of the whole thing?" Pearl didn't answer. She just looked at him, and in his eyes she saw the beginning of the story. It wasn't her story, not the real one of desperation and a dying mother. It was a better one. A story with a hero, or at least a heroine. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Truman unlocked her cell door. "You've got a visitor. Official." He led her not to the visiting room, but to his own office. A man in a clean, pressed suit stood up when she entered. He was thin, with ink stains on his fingers and a pair of spectacles perched on his nose. "Miss Hart, is it?" the man said. He had a notebook open, a pencil poised. "My name is Egan. Arizona Daily Citizen. I'd like to ask you a few questions for our readers." He said readers, as if he were talking about a king. Truman sat down behind his desk, making it clear he was staying. "She don't have to talk to you, Egan." "Of course not," the reporter said smoothly, his eyes never leaving Pearl. "But I imagine the prisoner might want her side of the story told. The right way." Pearl looked from the sheriff's weary face to the reporter's eager one. Her side of the story. The truth was a miserable, pathetic thing. A tale of bad choices and worse luck. But the story they wanted, that was something else entirely. She sat down in the chair opposite Egan, the coarse fabric of her boy's clothes scratching her skin. "What do you want to know?" she asked. "Let's start at the beginning," Egan said, his pencil already moving. "Where does a woman learn to handle a Colt revolver and stare down a stagecoach guard?" "A woman learns what she must," Pearl said, her voice quiet but clear. "When the world doesn't offer her a place, she has to make one for herself." Egan scribbled furiously. "And your partner? This Joe Boot. Was he the leader of your little enterprise?" Pearl thought of Joe, weeping on the ledge, a man broken by his own greed. Then she thought of the deputy's question. "Were you the brains?" "We were partners," she said, choosing her words with care. "But every partnership has a senior member. A man can be strong, but strength isn't always the same as sense." Egan's eyes lit up. This was better than he could have hoped for. "So you're saying you planned the robbery?" "I'm saying a woman who has been left with no options is more dangerous than any man with a plan," she countered, turning his question inside out. "I needed to get home. My mother is dying." She saw the flicker of sympathy in his eyes and knew she had him. She gave him pieces of the truth, polished and arranged to catch the light. She told him of her privileged childhood, hinting at a deep unhappiness. She spoke of a bad marriage, of being abandoned, of the desperation that drove her west. She left out the squalor, the hunger, the ugly, stupid mistakes. She was crafting a character, the fallen lady, the reluctant outlaw, the devoted daughter. And the robbery itself. Egan pressed. "Were you frightened?" Pearl allowed herself a small, wry smile. "I imagine I was far less frightened than the man with my gun pointed at his belly." Sheriff Truman made a sound that was half choke, half laugh, and tried to cover it with a cough. The interview went on for an hour. Pearl felt a strange sense of power, a feeling she hadn't had since she'd faced down the cattleman in Hattie's parlor. She was no longer a prisoner. She was a performer, and she had a captive audience. When Egan finally closed his notebook, his face was flushed with excitement. "This will be on the front page tomorrow, Miss Hart. The whole country will be reading your story." As Truman led her back to her cell, they passed the end of the hall. The door to the last cell was open a crack. Pearl glanced in. Joe Boot was huddled on his cot, his face to the wall, a single shuddering sob shaking his frame. He was the past. He was the mistake. The reporters didn't want his story. He was just another failed man. Back in her cell, the noise from the street seemed louder. She could hear men shouting her name now. "Pearl. Hey Pearl, look this way." Carlyle, the young deputy, appeared at her bars, holding a small polished tin mirror. "A lady from the church brought this. Said you might want it." Pearl took the mirror. She looked at her reflection. The face that stared back was smudged with dirt, the eyes shadowed with exhaustion. The hair was a hacked-off mess. But for the first time, she didn't see the runaway wife, or the failed saloon singer, or the boy bandit named Bill. She saw a flash of something else in her own eyes, a defiant spark. She saw the woman the reporter had seen, the woman the whole country was about to meet. She smiled at the reflection, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It wasn't a smile of happiness. It was a smile of recognition. The Bandit Queen was looking back at her, and she was ready for her audience. Chapter 16. You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. The bailiff mumbled the words like a prayer he'd long since stopped believing in. Pearl's hand rested on a Bible that was worn smooth by the hands of liars, thieves, and murderers. She looked out at the courtroom. It was packed to the rafters, a sweat-soaked collection of humanity craning their necks to get a look at her. The air was thick with the smell of cheap cigars and unwashed bodies. It was hotter than the inside of a furnace. "I do," she said, her voice carrying to the back row. She took her seat in the witness box. Her lawyer, a man named Mr. Franklin with a perpetually worried expression and a suit that was too heavy for the Arizona heat, gave her a weak, encouraging smile. Across the room, the prosecutor, Mr. Lowe, glared at her over a stack of law books. He was a bulldog of a man, with a thick neck and a reputation for chewing up witnesses. The trial had been a circus from day one. Egan's articles in The Citizen had turned her from a common criminal into a folk hero. They called her the Bandit Queen, the Lady Bandit. The story she'd spun in the sheriff's office had taken root, and now this courtroom was its garden. "Miss Hart," Lowe began, his voice a theatrical boom. "You are here today because you are accused of a most heinous crime. The armed robbery of a Wells Fargo stagecoach. Did you, on the 30th of May, hold a gun on a man named Johnny Finger and demand he turn over a box of money?" "I did not demand anything," Pearl said, her voice calm. She looked at the jury, 12 grim-faced ranchers and shopkeepers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. "I made a request." A ripple of laughter went through the courtroom. The judge banged his gavel, his face a thundercloud. "Order. The witness will answer the question." "My partner, Mr. Boot, handled the particulars of the conversation," Pearl continued, as if the judge hadn't spoken. "I was merely there to ensure everyone remained polite." Lowe's face went a shade redder. "Polite? You call pointing a loaded Colt revolver at a man's head polite?" "It's more polite than shooting him," she said. "Which I did not do. No one was harmed. A watch was taken, a box was borrowed. It was an inconvenience, not a massacre." "An inconvenience that carries a sentence of 30 years in the Yuma prison," Lowe shot back. "Let's talk about your partner, Joe Boot. He has confessed to the crime and implicated you as the mastermind. The brains of the operation, I believe he called you." "Mr. Boot is a desperate man, trying to save his own skin," Pearl said, her gaze sweeping the courtroom, landing on the reporters scribbling in their notebooks. "He would say I was the Queen of Sheba if he thought it would get him a lighter sentence. The truth is, Mr. Boot had the plan. I simply had the motivation." "And what was that motivation, Miss Hart?" Lowe asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A thirst for adventure? A desire for easy money?" "My mother is dying," Pearl said, the words falling into a suddenly silent room. She let the silence hang there, a heavy-weighted thing. "I received a telegram. I had no money for a train ticket. I was a woman alone, 1,000 miles from home, with no prospects and no hope. I did what I had to do." She looked directly at the jury. "I wonder how many men in this room, if faced with the same choice, would not have done the same for their own mothers." Franklin, her lawyer, was nodding his head, a look of pious approval on his face. Lowe looked like he'd just swallowed a wasp. "The law does not make exceptions for family emergencies," he thundered. "Then the law is a fool," Pearl said, her voice rising to match his. "The law is written by men, for men. It is a set of rules for a game I was never invited to play. I was not allowed to vote on the men who wrote those laws. I was not allowed to vote on the men who enforced them. I am to be judged by 12 men, prosecuted by a man, and sentenced by a man." She leaned forward, her eyes flashing. "You want to sentence me under a set of laws I have no voice in? Then I say you have no right to sentence me at all. I will not be tried by a law in which I have no voice." The courtroom erupted. Men were on their feet, shouting. The judge hammered his gavel, his face purple with rage, but his voice was lost in the din. Egan and the other reporters were writing so fast, Pearl thought their pencils might catch fire. She had just given them their headline, their legend. It took 5 full minutes for the bailiffs to restore a semblance of order. When the room was quiet again, Lowe stood there, momentarily speechless. He had lost control of the room, of the narrative of the entire trial. Pearl had turned his courtroom into her stage. He shuffled his papers, flustered. You admit to being there? To holding the gun?" "I admit to being a woman in a world that has left me no other choice," she said. "I did what was necessary for my family. My only real crime was being born a woman in a man's world. And for that, I suppose I must be punished." She settled back in her chair, the picture of defiant martyrdom. She saw it on the faces of the jury. They weren't looking at a highway robber anymore. They were looking at a daughter, a victim, a rebel. They were looking at a story they wanted to believe in. The rest of the trial was a formality. Joe Boot was brought in to testify. He was a shadow of the man she'd met, his eyes hollow, his voice a monotone mumble as he recited the facts of the crime. He looked at her once, a look of pure, venomous hatred, and she met it with a cool, pitying gaze. He was a loose end. She was the main event. When the jury filed out, the air in the room was thick with anticipation. They were gone for less than an hour. Pearl stood with Franklin as they filed back in, their faces unreadable. The foreman, a grizzled old rancher with hands like leather, cleared his throat. He unfolded a piece of paper. On the charge of armed robbery, he read, his voice raspy, "We the jury find the defendant, Pearl Hart." He paused, letting the entire room hold its breath. Not guilty. The room exploded. A roar went up from the spectators. Men threw their hats in the air. Egan was already running for the door, his story already written in his head. Pearl felt Franklin's hand grip her arm, his worried face suddenly split by a grin of disbelief. She stood there, motionless in the eye of the storm. Not guilty. The words seemed to come from another world. She had won. She had played their game by her own rules and beaten them. As the crowd surged forward, a deputy moved to escort her out a side door. Before she left the courtroom, she caught the eye of Mrs. Elias Pethbridge, the woman from the stagecoach who was standing in the back, her face a mask of cold fury. Their eyes locked for a moment across the chaotic room. The verdict hadn't changed the contempt in the woman's eyes. It had only deepened it. The deputy pulled at Pearl's arm, guiding her through the throng and into a dusty back hallway. The roar of the crowd was still audible through the thick adobe walls. She was free. But as she took her first step out of the courthouse and into the blinding Arizona sun, a federal marshal stepped into her path, a new set of papers in his hand. Chapter 17. Pearl Hart. The federal marshal's voice was as dry as the dust in the alley. He was a tall man, built like a plank, with a face that seemed to have been carved from wood and left out in the sun. He didn't seem impressed by the roar of the crowd still echoing from the front of the courthouse. He just held up the papers. "You're under arrest." Pearl stared at him. The blinding sun made her dizzy. The elation of the verdict, the sweet, intoxicating taste of freedom, evaporated like a drop of water on a hot skillet. "I've just been acquitted." "You've been acquitted by a territorial court of robbing a private company," the marshal said, his voice flat and patient, as if explaining a simple sum to a difficult child. "I'm arresting you on behalf of the United States government for the robbery of U.S. mail. It's a different crime. And I assure you, it's a different world." Her lawyer, Franklin, came bustling out of the courthouse, his face still flushed with victory. The flush drained away when he saw the marshal. "Now see here, Marshal, this is an outrage. The woman has been found innocent." "Innocent of one thing, maybe," the marshal said, taking Pearl's arm in a grip that was surprisingly gentle but utterly firm. "But the mailbags on that stage had federal postmarks. That makes it my business." He started leading her away, back toward the jail she had just left. "You can file your outrage with the federal clerk, Mr. Franklin. I'm sure he'll put it in the proper pile." The new cell was different. The territorial jail had been adobe and wood, smelling of old sweat and desperation. This one, in the federal wing, was stone and iron. It was cold, even in the afternoon heat. The air was still and silent. There were no crowds shouting her name, no reporters trying to catch a glimpse of her. The silence was more terrifying than any noise. Franklin came to see her an hour later. His suit was rumpled, and his worried expression had returned, deeper this time. "It's bad, Pearl," he said, gripping the bars. "They're not bluffing. The U.S. Attorney for the territory is handling it himself. A man named Alexander. Is he another bulldog, like Lowe?" "Worse." Franklin shook his head. "He's a scholar. Quiet man. Doesn't shout. He just builds his case, brick by brick, until it's a wall you can't see over. And he doesn't lose." "But it's the same crime," she insisted, the injustice of it a bitter taste in her mouth. "It's not, don't you see? That's the trap. Robbing Wells Fargo is a crime against property. Robbing the U.S. mail, they see that as a crime against the nation itself. It's like spitting on the flag. The jury won't be 12 local ranchers who read your story in the paper. It'll be 12 men who have been vetted by a federal judge. They won't be sympathetic to a dying mother. They'll only see the mail bag." The celebrity she had so carefully cultivated, the persona of the Bandit Queen that had saved her, had now become her undoing. A small-time stick-up might have been ignored by the federal authorities. But she wasn't small-time anymore. She was a headline. The United States government couldn't afford to be made a fool of by a woman the whole country was talking about. Her fame was the evidence they would use against her. The next day, she was brought not to a courtroom, but to a small wood-paneled office. The U.S. Attorney, Alexander, was exactly as Franklin had described. He was a slight man, with thinning hair and hands that were folded neatly on his desk. He didn't rise when she entered. He just watched her with intelligent, dispassionate eyes. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice soft. "Please have a seat." She sat. The marshal stood by the door, his arms crossed. "Your recent trial was quite the spectacle," Alexander began, a faint, ironic smile touching his lips. "You are, it seems, a very gifted storyteller." "I told the truth," Pearl said. "You told a version of it. A very effective version." He leaned forward slightly. "And in doing so, you created a problem for me. You see, when a local celebrity makes a mockery of the law, it emboldens others. It suggests that the rule of law is optional. The federal government does not consider its laws to be optional. What do you want?" "I want this to be over," he said simply. "I have no desire for another circus. The newspapers have had their fun. Now, it's time for the quiet business of the law to proceed." He slid a document across the desk. "This is a plea agreement. You will plead guilty to 1 count of tampering with the United States mail. In exchange, the charge of armed robbery of a federal officer, the stagecoach guard is technically a mail guard, will be dropped." "And the sentence?" "The prosecution will recommend a term of 5 years to be served at the Territorial Prison in Yuma." 5 years. The words landed like stones. Yuma. She'd heard the men at Hattie's talk about Yuma. They called it the hellhole. A sun-scorched fortress on the Colorado River where men were baked alive in cells called the oven. "And if I refuse," she asked, her voice steady. "If I choose to tell my story to another jury?" Alexander's faint smile vanished. "Then we will proceed to trial on all charges. We will bring in your partner, Mr. Boot, who has already agreed to testify against you in exchange for leniency. We will bring in the passengers. We will bring in postal inspectors from Washington. We will build a case so airtight and undeniable that the jury will have no choice but to convict you. And when they do, I will stand before the judge and ask that you be given the maximum sentence for both counts. 30 years. He let that sink in. "You are 28 years old, Miss Hart. You do the arithmetic." This was the real law. Not the blustering, emotional theater of the territorial court. This was a cold, quiet machine of logic and leverage. She had no story that would work here, no jury she could charm. Her fame was a liability, her defiance a weakness. They had taken all her weapons away. "You've boxed me in," she said, the words a statement of fact, not a complaint. "That is the purpose of the law," Alexander said. He stood up. "You have until tomorrow morning to sign the agreement. If you do not, I will take it as your refusal, and we will begin preparations for a trial that you cannot possibly win." He walked to the door. "I hope you make a wise decision, Miss Hart. Yuma is a difficult place, and 30 years is a very long time to be proven right." The marshal escorted her back to the silent stone and iron cell. He left her there with the papers, the government's neat and tidy solution to the problem she had become. She walked to the high, narrow window. She couldn't see the street, only a patch of sky, a blue so deep and vast it hurt to look at. She had been free for less than 60 seconds. It had been a beautiful illusion. She looked down at the plea agreement in her hand, the dense legalistic words a cage made of paper. She thought of her mother, of the train ticket she would never buy. She thought of the 5 years in the hellhole, a living death under the desert sun. Then she thought of the alternative, 30 years, a lifetime. Her hand tightened on the documents. She could feel the sharp edges of the paper against her palm. With a sudden, sharp motion, she tore the agreement cleanly in two. Chapter 18. They call this the hellhole. The voice came from the other cell, a low rumble that seemed to rise from the stone floor itself. Pearl stood in the center of her new world, a stone box 6 feet by 8. The heat was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating blanket woven from sun, rock, and human misery. "I can see why," Pearl said, her own voice sounding thin and brittle. "You get used to it," the voice said. "Or you die. Either way, the heat stops bothering you." Pearl moved to the bars. The women's ward was a short, dead-end corridor with 2 cells facing each other, sealed off from the rest of the prison by a heavy iron door. In the opposite cell sat a woman built on the scale of a draft horse, with a broad, impassive face and arms corded with muscle. "I'm Maria," the woman said. "They call me Big Maria. Saves time." "Pearl, I know who you are." Maria grunted. "Read all about you." The iron rose. "Sounds fancy. Let's see how you hold up in this garden." The iron door at the end of the corridor groaned open, and Captain Bale filled the space. His shadow fell long and dark across the stone floor. He stopped between their cells, his muddy water eyes flicking from Maria to Pearl. "Hart," he said, the name sounding like a curse. "Let's get the rules straight. You're not a headline in here. You're not a dime novel. You're number 732. You'll work in the laundry. You'll speak only when spoken to by a guard. You will not interact with the male prisoners. You will cause me no trouble. Am I clear?" "As glass," Pearl said. Bale's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to inmates meeting his gaze. "You're a celebrity now. But fame is a weak currency in here. Remember that." He turned and walked out, the iron door slamming shut with a sound of absolute finality. "He's a peach," Maria said into the ringing silence. The next morning, the bell clanged before dawn. The walk to the laundry was a lesson in itself. A guard led them through the main yard, a sprawling, dusty expanse where hundreds of men in striped uniforms were lining up for their own work details. A dead, oppressive silence fell as they passed. Every head turned. Hundreds of pairs of eyes, curious, hungry, hateful, followed their every step. Pearl kept her chin up, her gaze fixed straight ahead, but she could feel the weight of their stares like a physical touch. This was not a prison. It was a cage full of starving wolves, and she was the fresh meat. The laundry was a cavern of steam and noise. Enormous vats of water boiled over open fires, the air thick with the caustic smell of lye soap. Male prisoners, stripped to the waist, their bodies slick with sweat, stirred the vats with long wooden paddles, or hauled massive baskets of wet linens. The women's section was a designated corner of the room, separated by a clear line on the floor that no one dared cross. Here, Pearl and Maria were tasked with folding the clean hot sheets. The guards watched from a raised catwalk, their rifles held at the ready. It was controlled chaos, a carefully managed circle of hell. For the first few days, no one spoke to her. The men watched her, their conversations dropping to murmurs when she got close, but they kept their distance. The legend preceded her. They were waiting, watching to see if the iron rose was as thorny as the stories claimed. The test came on the 4th day. Lunch was a piece of dry bread and a ladle of thin, greasy soup, eaten standing in their designated corner. A lifer named Santos, a man with a spiderweb tattoo covering one side of his face, sauntered over to the line on the floor. He didn't cross it. He just stood there, staring at Pearl. "Heard you was a queen on the outside," Santos said, his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Don't look like much in here. Look like you could use some extra bread." He held up his own piece, a chunk missing where he'd taken a bite. Pearl didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on her soup. "I'm not hungry." "Oh, I think you are," Santos sneered. A few of the other men laughed. This was a game, a public challenge. He was testing her, trying to break her down in front of an audience. From the catwalk, she could see Captain Bale watching, a flicker of interest in his flat, dead eyes. He wasn't going to intervene. Pearl set her soup tin down. She looked at Santos, her gaze calm and direct. "What do you want, Santos?" He was taken aback that she knew his name. "Just being friendly." "No, you're not," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the humid air. "You're trying to decide if I'm a victim. You should know, I've had practice with men like you. My first husband had the same look in his eye. It didn't end well for him. It was a lie, but it was a good one. It was a piece of her legend." Santos's sneer faltered. He was a bully, used to preying on fear. He didn't know what to do with a woman who wasn't afraid of him. "And if that's not enough," Pearl continued, her voice dropping slightly, "I also know that you're the one who's been skimming tobacco from the warden's private stash. And I know you trade it to a guard named Miller for extra rations." She saw the flicker of panic in his eyes. Big Maria had been a wealth of information in the long, dark hours in their cells. "I imagine Captain Bale would be very interested to know why one of his guards is getting fat while the others are on standard issue. He might even wonder what else Miller is trading." The color drained from Santos's face. He was trapped. If he backed down, he looked like a coward. If he pushed, she would ruin his comfortable arrangement. He was a king in the laundry, but she had just shown him that she knew where he kept his crown. He stared at her for a long, silent moment. The entire room was watching. Finally, he gave a short, jerky nod, turned and walked away without another word. A low murmur went through the room. The balance of power had shifted. She hadn't used a threat of violence. She had used information. In a place where knowledge was the only real currency, she had just proven she was richer than any of them. On the catwalk, Captain Bale's face was a mask of cold fury. She hadn't broken any rules. She had done nothing he could punish her for. But she had won. She had established her own authority right under his nose, and he knew it. That night, back in the suffocating quiet of her cell, Pearl lay on her stone slab, listening to the distant, lonely sound of a train whistle. It was a sound of the outside world, a world she might not see again for 5 years. She thought of her mother. She thought of the life that had led her here. She heard a soft scraping sound from the cell opposite. A small object slid under her cell door. She reached down in the dark. It was a piece of soap. Not the harsh, gritty lye soap they were issued, but a small, smooth cake of what smelled like lavender. a contraband luxury, smuggled from the warden's own house. She looked across the corridor. In the dim moonlight filtering through the high window, she could just make out Big Maria's shape. The big woman gave a single, slow nod. Pearl took the soap. She went to the bucket in the corner and poured a little of the stale water over her hands. She worked the soap into a lather, the scent of lavender a ghost of a memory from another life. She methodically washed the prison grime from her hands, scrubbing until her skin was raw. It was a small thing, a useless gesture. But it was hers. It was an act of defiance. And in the Yuma Territorial Prison, that was the only thing that mattered. Chapter 19. Fresh Fish. The voice was a low, gravelly rasp that came from the cell opposite hers. Pearl didn't look up. She was staring at the 6-foot by 8-foot stone box that was her new home. A thin, lice-infested mattress lay on a stone slab. A bucket sat in the corner. The heat was a living thing, radiating from the walls, pressing in on her, stealing the air from her lungs. This wasn't a cell. It was a tomb for the living. "I'm talking to you, celebrity," the voice rasped again. "The little lady bandit. You're prettier than your pictures." Pearl finally turned her head. In the shadows of the facing cell, she could make out the shape of a woman, broad and powerful, with a face that looked like it had been in a long argument with a rock. "And you are?" Pearl asked, her voice steady. The woman laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "They call me Big Maria. Because I'm big. And my name's Maria. What's your excuse?" "I'm Pearl. And I'm not a celebrity." "Tell that to the warden," Big Maria grunted. "Had us scrubbing this whole cell block for 2 days before you got here. Said he wanted to make a good impression on his special guest. You're the only woman in this whole damn prison, besides me and the laundresses. That makes you special." A guard's footsteps echoed down the stone corridor, the sound sharp and loud in the oppressive silence. He stopped at Pearl's cell. His name was Captain Bale, a man with a drooping mustache and eyes the color of muddy water. He looked at her, the way a man looks at a strange and dangerous new animal. "You'll have a work assignment in the morning, Hart," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Until then, you'll stay in your cell. You'll be silent during lockdown. You'll eat what you're given. You understand?" "I understand," Pearl said. "She understands," Big Maria called out from her cell. "She's a smart one. Read all about her in the papers." Bale shot a venomous look at Maria's cell. "You keep your mouth shut, Maria, or you'll be back in the snake den." He turned his flat, empty gaze back to Pearl. "Don't get any ideas. You're not special here. You're just a number." He walked away, his footsteps receding, leaving the two women alone in the suffocating heat and silence. "The snake den," Pearl said into the quiet. "What's that?" "A punishment cell," Maria's voice came back, lower now. "A hole in the ground. Dark. They say it's full of scorpions and centipedes. I ain't ever seen it myself. I just know you don't want to go there." She paused. "Bale's a bastard. Watch out for him. He likes to make examples of people." Pearl's work assignment was the laundry. It was a steam-filled, hellish room where a dozen male prisoners, their faces grim and slick with sweat, washed the prison's linens in enormous boiling vats. The heat was even worse than in the cell block. The guards watched them from a raised platform, rifles held ready. Her first day, a lifer with a scarred face and a missing ear tried to corner her behind a stack of folded sheets. "Look what we got here," he hissed, his breath sour. "A little desert flower." Pearl didn't scream. She didn't run. She picked up the heavy wooden paddle, used to stir the boiling laundry. She held it like a baseball bat. "The next thing you say to me," she said, her voice low and even, "you'll be saying it without teeth." The man hesitated, surprised by the cold fury in her eyes. He looked from her face to the heavy paddle, then back again. He laughed, a nervous, uncertain sound, and backed away. From across the room, she saw Big Maria, who worked the massive clothes wringer, give her a slow, approving nod. An alliance had been formed without a word. Weeks turned into months. Pearl learned the brutal rhythm of Yuma. The pre-dawn wake-up bell. The tasteless mush for breakfast. The 10 hours of mind-numbing, back-breaking labor in the laundry. The slow, suffocating afternoons in her cell, where the only thing to do was watch the sliver of sky through the high, narrow window and try not to go mad. She learned to read the prison's secret language. The way a cough could be a warning. The way a dropped spoon could be a signal. She learned which guards could be bribed with a whispered word to a visitor, and which ones enjoyed their work too much. She learned that survival here had nothing to do with strength, and everything to do with not showing weakness. Her fame, which had been her curse, slowly became her shield. The other prisoners, who would have preyed on any other woman, mostly left her alone. They were afraid of the legend. They'd read the dime novels that were already being written about her, the sensationalized accounts of the Bandit Queen who stared down a dozen men. They didn't want to find out how much of it was true. The guards, too, treated her with a wary distance. She was a problem they didn't know how to solve. Captain Bale seemed to take it as a personal insult. He gave her the worst jobs, the longest hours. He searched her cell twice as often as anyone else's. He was looking for a crack, a moment of weakness he could exploit. One day, a new prisoner arrived in the laundry, a young Mexican boy convicted of stealing a horse. He was terrified, his eyes wide with a fear that made him a target. Within an hour, the lifer with the scarred face had cornered the boy, demanding his food ration. Pearl watched from her station at the folding tables. She saw the boy's trembling hands, the lifer's predatory grin. She saw the guards on the platform, watching, doing nothing. This was how the prison worked. The strong ate the weak. Pearl walked over, her movements calm and deliberate. She didn't have a paddle this time. She just stood between the lifer and the boy. "Leave him alone," she said. The lifer sneered. "Or what, little lady? You gonna write a bad story about me in the newspaper?" "No," Pearl said. She looked him in the eye. "I'm going to tell my lawyer that you confessed to him about the guard you killed in Prescott. The one they hanged the wrong man for." The man's face went slack, the color draining from it. It was a complete bluff. A wild guess, based on a half-heard rumor she'd picked up from Big Maria. But she said it with such absolute certainty, such cold conviction, that it hit him like a physical blow. He stared at her, his mind racing, trying to figure out how she could possibly know. He saw the unblinking confidence in her eyes, and his own nerve broke. He muttered a curse and slunk away. The young Mexican boy looked at her, his eyes shining with a gratitude that was almost painful to see. From that day on, he was her shadow, her devoted servant, a small piece of loyalty in a world of betrayal. That evening, Captain Bale stood outside her cell, his face a mask of cold fury. "You think you're clever, Hart," he said through the bars. "I think you should do your job and protect your prisoners," she replied, not looking at him. "You're a cancer in this prison," he hissed. "You and your stories. You think you're running things. But I'll break you. One way or another, I'll see you broken." He stormed off. Pearl stood up and walked to the bars of her cell. She looked across the corridor at Big Maria, who was watching her with a strange expression on her rough face. "What?" Pearl asked. "The Iron Rose," Maria said, her voice a low rumble. "That's what they're calling you now. The men. Because you look like a flower, but you're all thorns and steel." Pearl gripped the cold iron bars of her cell door. The name settled over her, a mantle she hadn't asked for but had earned nonetheless. The Iron Rose. She looked down at her hands, raw and red from the lye soap in the laundry. They didn't look like the hands of a rose. They looked like the hands of a survivor. She gripped the bars tighter, the iron biting into her palms, and held on. Chapter 20. You're looking a little green around the gills. Big Maria's voice was a low rumble from the opposite cell. Pearl was sitting on the edge of her stone slab, her head in her hands. The morning's mush sat untouched in its tin bowl on the floor. For the third day in a row, the smell of it had turned her stomach. It's the heat, Pearl said, not looking up. It's been hot for a year, Maria grunted. This is different. You sick? I'm fine. But she wasn't. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion had settled over her, something beyond the usual fatigue from the laundry's steam and toil. She felt a change in the chemistry of her own body, a subtle shift in the tides within. It was a feeling she remembered, a ghost of a sensation from a life before Yuma. In the laundry, she nearly fainted while lifting a basket of wet sheets. She stumbled, catching herself on the edge of a folding table. The room swam for a moment, the roar of the fires and the chatter of the men fading to a distant hum. Captain Bale, watching from his catwalk, saw the whole thing. A flicker of something that might have been satisfaction crossed his face. He'd been waiting for her to break. Hart, he barked. If you can't do the work, you can spend the day in the snake den. Maybe the dark will do you good. She's fine, Big Maria cut in, stepping in front of Pearl. Just the heat getting to her. She shot Pearl a look that was both a warning and a question. That night Pearl was sick. She barely made it to the bucket in the corner of her cell. The retching was violent and loud in the stone corridor. From the opposite cell, Maria's voice was quiet. How long's it been since your last monthly? Pearl went still, her hand gripping the rim of the bucket. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence was its own confession. Sweet Jesus, Maria whispered into the dark. How? It's not possible, Pearl said, more to herself than to Maria. But she knew it was. A guard named Miller, the one Santos had been trading with. A moment of carelessness, a whispered negotiation, in a dark corner of the laundry for an extra blanket, a moment that had felt like a small victory at the time. Now it felt like a catastrophe. Or something else. The next morning, she couldn't get out of bed. She officially reported herself sick, a move she had avoided for her entire sentence. The prison doctor, a man named Shaw with whiskey on his breath and a profound lack of interest in his patients, was summoned. He stood outside her cell, not bothering to come in. What's wrong with you, Hart? I've been feeling faint, Pearl said, her voice deliberately weak. Dizzy spells. And I'm sick to my stomach every morning. Dr. Shaw sighed, the sound of a man burdened by the endless complaints of convicts. You're not eating. You're dehydrated. Drink more water. It's more than that, doctor, Pearl said, letting a note of pleading enter her voice. I think I might be with child. The doctor stopped. He stared at her, his jaded eyes suddenly sharp and focused. A woman getting pregnant in his prison was not a simple case of dehydration. It was a scandal. It was a report to the territorial governor. It was a problem. That's impossible, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Pearl met his gaze. I'm a woman, doctor. And this is a prison full of men. You do the arithmetic. He stood there for a long time, the implications washing over his face. Finally, he turned to the guard. Take her to the infirmary. I'll examine her there. The infirmary was a cleaner, quieter circle of hell. Dr. Shaw's examination was cursory, his hands clumsy and impersonal. But he was no fool. He asked questions. He listened to her symptoms. He looked at her. Well, she asked when he was finished. He wouldn't meet her eye. He just scribbled a note on a chart. You'll be kept here, under observation. Lighter duties. Extra rations. He turned to leave. Doctor, she called after him. Am I? He paused at the door, his back to her. My official diagnosis is exhaustion and malnutrition, he said, his voice clipped. Anything else is speculation at this point. But the rumor was already loose. A guard in the infirmary, a young man who read the dime novels about her, whispered it to a trustee. The trustee whispered it to the men in the mess hall. By nightfall, the entire prison was buzzing with the impossible news. The Bandit Queen, the Iron Rose, was pregnant. The news traveled beyond the walls. A letter from a discharged prisoner to his family. A mention in a local newspaper, couched in careful, speculative language. An unusual situation is developing at the Territorial Prison involving its most famous female inmate. It reached the warden's office. Warden Miller was a politician in a prison guard's uniform. He cared about budgets, appearances, and keeping the governor happy. A pregnant female prisoner was a disaster on all three fronts. It implied lax security, corrupt guards, and a scandal that could cost him his job. He summoned Pearl to his office. It was the first time she'd seen him up close. He was a man who had grown soft behind a desk. This is a delicate situation, Hart, he said, avoiding her gaze, focusing instead on a paperweight on his desk. It's a natural one, Warden, Pearl replied. An impossible one, he corrected her. One that could prove embarrassing for this institution. For the territory. I imagine it could, she said, letting the silence stretch. She was no longer a prisoner asking for mercy. She was a woman holding a lit stick of dynamite, and they were both in a very small room. What do you want? He finally asked, the question she had been waiting for. What does any mother want for her child? Pearl said, her voice soft. A life. A chance. A world that isn't a 6-by-8-foot stone box. A child should not be born in the Yuma Territorial Prison. I can't imagine the governor would want that on his record. The warden's eyes flickered. She had said the magic word. Governor. A pardon is out of the question, he said quickly. I'm not asking for a pardon, Pearl said. I'm asking for a commutation. A release on compassionate grounds. Let me serve my time on the outside. Let my child be born free. You would be a hero, Warden. A man of mercy and modern thinking. He stared at her, caught in the trap she had laid. If he kept her, the scandal would grow every day her belly grew. If he released her, he would be praised for his humanity. He was a politician, and she had just handed him the perfect political solution. I will take it under advisement, he said, his voice stiff. I will have to write a report to the governor's office. A recommendation will have to be made. He dismissed her. As the guard led her from the office, not back to her cell, but to the relative comfort of the infirmary, Pearl allowed herself the smallest of smiles. She placed a hand on her still flat stomach. It was a desperate gamble, a wild, improbable bluff. But it was the only card she had left to play. She had no idea if she was actually pregnant. But she had planted the seed of the idea, and now all of America was about to watch it grow. Chapter 21. This way, Miss Hart. Governor's orders. The deputy's voice was stiff, his hand a firm guiding pressure on her elbow. Pearl stepped out of the Yuma prison gates, not as a prisoner, but as a problem being quietly disposed of. The morning sun was a physical blow, a shock of light and heat after 18 months in the gray twilight of the hellhole. She blinked, her eyes watering, and saw a black lacquered buggy waiting, its leather seats shimmering in the heat. Warden Miller stood by the buggy, a man sweating in his Sunday suit. He wouldn't look at her. He just stared at a point somewhere over her shoulder. "The governor has seen fit to grant you a conditional pardon, Hart," he said, the words sounding like they'd been memorized, "on the grounds that Arizona Territory is not equipped to provide adequate care for an expectant mother. You are not to return to this territory. Is that understood?" "And the baby?" Pearl asked, her hand instinctively going to her stomach, which was still as flat as the day she'd walked in. The warden's face tightened. The great unasked question. The bluff that had won her freedom. "That is no longer the prison's concern. The train ticket will take you as far as Kansas City. From there, you are on your own." He thrust a thick envelope into her hand and practically shoved her toward the buggy. As she climbed in, she caught a glimpse of Captain Bale watching from the guard tower, his face a thundercloud of thwarted rage. She gave him a small, slow smile, a final twist of the knife, before the buggy door closed, shutting out the sight of the prison for good. The ride to the train station was silent. The deputy stared straight ahead, his jaw set. Pearl looked out the window at the dusty streets of Yuma, a town she had only ever seen from the inside of a cage. It looked small and mean. The train station was a different world. A crowd was gathered on the platform, a buzzing swarm of reporters, photographers, and the merely curious. They surged forward when they saw her, a wave of shouting faces and popping flashbulbs. "Pearl, is it true about the baby? Who's the father, Pearl? Did you charm the governor himself?" Before she could be swallowed by the mob, a man stepped in front of her. He was stout, impeccably dressed in a pinstripe suit, with a diamond stick pin in his tie, and a smile that was all teeth. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone that cut through the noise. "Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Phineas T. Cole, theatrical promoter and manager of talent. And you, my dear lady, are the greatest talent this country has seen in a decade." He took her arm and began to carve a path through the crowd with the sheer force of his presence, the deputy struggling to keep up. "I've been following your case, of course," Cole said, his voice a low, confidential murmur in her ear. "Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. The trial, the defiance, the delicate condition. Pure theater of the highest order." They reached the train, a private car that Cole had apparently arranged. He ushered her up the steps, into a compartment of polished wood and plush velvet seats. He closed the door, shutting out the clamor of the crowd. "A glass of champagne to celebrate your freedom?" he offered, already pulling a bottle from an ice bucket. "It's a little early for me," Pearl said, sinking into a seat. The soft velvet felt alien after months of stone and rough cotton. "Nonsense. It's never too early for a new beginning." He poured 2 glasses. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Hart. Your story, your legend, is the most valuable commodity in America right now. People are hungry for it. They want to see the Iron Rose, the Bandit Queen, in the flesh. And you want to sell them tickets." His smile widened. "Precisely. I represent a Wild West show. A spectacle of horsemanship, marksmanship, and historical reenactments. We have cowboys, Indians, sharpshooters, but we don't have a star. We don't have you." He slid a contract across the small table. "We would recreate your famous robbery. Tastefully, of course. You would be the main attraction. You would tell your story, in your own words. The pay, as you can see, is substantial." Pearl looked at the number on the paper. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life. More than had been in the Wells Fargo box. "What makes you think I'd want to do that?" she asked. "Relive the worst day of my life, twice a day for a crowd of strangers?" "Because, my dear, your options are limited," Cole said, his charming smile never wavering. "You are the most famous woman in America, but you are also a convicted felon. Who will hire you? Who will trust you? You can't go back to being a cook or a singer. That life is over. The world has made you into a legend. My proposition allows you to own that legend, to profit from it. The alternative is to be haunted by it for the rest of your days. The train lurched forward, pulling away from the station. Pearl looked out the window. She saw the faces of the crowd, still staring, still hungry. She saw the dusty, bleak landscape of Arizona begin to slide past. The warden had banished her. She couldn't go back. She thought of the envelope in her hand. A train ticket to Kansas City. And then what? A cheap boarding house. A life of looking over her shoulder. And what of the baby? The lie that had freed her was now a ticking clock. Sooner or later, the world would discover there was no child. The story you want me to tell, she said, looking at Cole. Is it my story? Or yours? It's the story the people want to hear, he said smoothly. A story of adventure, of a brave woman fighting against the odds. A little romance, a little danger. We can adjust the facts to suit the narrative. You want me to lie. I want you to entertain, he corrected her. The truth is whatever the audience believes it is. You, of all people, should understand that. She looked down at the contract again. The numbers shimmered. It was a different kind of robbery, a different kind of lie. But it was a way forward. It was a way to control the story instead of being consumed by it. The train whistle blew, a long, mournful cry that sounded like a farewell. She was leaving Arizona behind. She was leaving the girl who had been arrested on that sun-blasted ledge. She picked up the pen that Cole had so thoughtfully placed beside the contract. She thought of her mother, of the home she still couldn't reach. This money could change that. It could buy more than a ticket. It could buy a second chance. There will be conditions, she said, her voice hard. I get to approve the script. I get my own dressing room. And I get paid in cash every week. Phineas T. Cole's smile was blinding. My dear Miss Hart, he said, raising his champagne glass. I wouldn't have it any other way. Pearl signed her name, the ink a dark final stroke on the paper. She had sold her past to buy her future. Chapter 22. More feeling, my dear. You're not ordering a steak, you're robbing a stagecoach. Give me desperation. Give me fire. Phineas T. Cole stood in the middle of the dusty arena, his diamond stick pin flashing in the gaslights. He gestured with a silver-tipped cane at the tableau in front of him, a rickety paint-chipped stagecoach, two nervous-looking actors dressed as a driver and guard, and Pearl holding a prop gun that felt unnervingly light in her hand. The line is, throw down the box, Pearl said, her voice flat. There's not a lot of poetry in it. It's not about the words, it's about the music, Cole exclaimed, striding toward her. You are the Iron Rose, the Bandit Queen. When you speak, the audience should feel a chill. They should see the flash of the desert sun in your eyes. He lowered his voice. They paid 50 cents for a chill, Pearl. Give it to them. She looked past him, at the empty wooden bleachers that circled the arena. In 2 hours, they would be filled with families, with men and women and children chewing popcorn, waiting to see her perform the act that had nearly cost her her life. This was their third week in St. Louis. The show was a massive success. And every night, Pearl died a little. Let's take it from the top, Cole said, clapping his hands. The approach. Remember, you're a boy. Walk like a boy. No, not like that. You look like you're trying to sneak out of church. You're a road agent. Shoulders back, a bit of a swagger. Think of it as business. Pearl adjusted the dusty hat on her head, the brim hiding the short hair she was painstakingly trying to grow out. She walked out from behind the painted canvas cactus, the prop gun held low. The actor playing Joe Boot, a failed Shakespearean named Alistair who drank too much, stepped out from the other side, brandishing a shotgun. Throw down the box. Alistair boomed, his voice full of stage-trained projection. And your valuables, Pearl added, her own voice sounding thin and ridiculous in comparison. The two actors on the box dutifully threw down a wooden chest and a few prop watches. Pearl and Alistair were supposed to gather the loot, hop on their waiting horses, and gallop off to a thunderous round of applause and a cloud of strategically deployed dust. She hated it. She hated the cheap costumes, the flimsy props, the way Alistair always winked at the crowd when he delivered his lines. Most of all, she hated the feeling of turning her own desperation into a parlor trick. The fear she'd felt on that road to Florence had been real, a cold, metallic taste in her mouth. Here, it was just part of the show, a cheap thrill sold for pocket change. After the rehearsal, she sat in her private dressing tent, a canvas room filled with a cracked mirror, a cot, and the constant smell of sawdust and horse manure. The money was real, at least. Cole paid her in cash every Saturday, a thick stack of bills she kept locked in a small steel box under her cot. It was growing. Soon it would be enough. Enough for a ticket to Ontario. Enough to face her mother. There was a knock on the tent pole. Miss Hart. It was a young man, a reporter from one of the St. Louis papers. Cole encouraged the interviews. They were good for business. Come in, she said wearily. He was young, with earnest eyes and a notebook already open. I just wanted to ask, what does it feel like? To be up there every night, reliving the most dangerous moment of your life? It's a job, Pearl said. But it must be thrilling, he insisted. To be a part of the Wild West. A real-life legend. Pearl looked at him. He saw the Bandit Queen, the woman on the posters. He didn't see the girl who had scrubbed floors in a Trinidad saloon, or the woman who had listened to the screams of men in the Yuma prison. The Wild West is mostly just dust and disappointment, she said. The legends are the easy parts to remember. People forget the rest. The reporter looked confused, as if she'd just given him the wrong answer to a simple question. That night, the show went on as it always did. The stands were packed. The roar of the crowd was a physical thing, a wave of noise that washed over the arena. Pearl went through the motions, her body moving on its own while her mind drifted. She said her lines. She gathered the fake loot. But tonight, something was different. As she and Alistair made their final turn on their horses, waving to the cheering crowd, she saw a face in the front row. A man in a dark coat, his face half hidden in the shadows. He wasn't cheering. He was just watching her, his expression unreadable. It was Hart. Her blood went cold. He looked older, thinner, the charm worn away to reveal the cheap material underneath. But it was him. The whiskey-colored eyes, the slight crooked smile. He just sat there, watching her perform a life he had helped create. She almost faltered, her horse sensing the sudden tension in her grip. She forced herself to finish the circuit, to wave to the crowd, to smile the Bandit Queen's smile. As she rode out of the arena, her heart was a frantic bird beating against her ribs. She half expected him to be waiting for her at her tent, but he wasn't. Cole was there, his face beaming. Magnificent, my dear. Simply magnificent. The crowd adores you. He pressed a small, velvet-wrapped box into her hand. A token of my appreciation. For our star. She opened it later, alone in her tent. Inside, nestled on a bed of satin, was a small, pearl-handled ladies' pistol, its metalwork engraved with roses. An iron rose. A prop for a character she couldn't seem to escape. She sat on her cot, the toy gun in one hand, the memory of Hart's face in her mind. He was here. A ghost from a past she was trying to outrun. What did he want? Money. Revenge. The lie of her pregnancy was becoming more difficult to maintain. Cole had started dropping hints about a brief hiatus for the show's star, a well-deserved rest. She knew she was running out of time. She stood up and walked to the tent flap, peering out into the bustling, chaotic world of the traveling show. Roustabouts were taking down stalls. Cowboys were drinking by a fire, the sound of a fiddle sawing through the night air. It was a world of illusion, of stories bought and sold. She had become the star of the biggest lie of all. She looked down at the pearl-handled pistol in her hand. It was a beautiful, useless thing. A prop. But as she clicked the hammer back, the sound was sharp and real in the quiet of the tent. She let the hammer fall on an empty chamber, the click echoing the one in her own heart. The show would go on tomorrow, but tonight, a different kind of curtain had risen. Chapter 23. You look like $1 million, Pearl. Or is it 4,000? Hart's voice was the same, a low, intimate drawl that had once sounded like a promise and now just sounded like a bill coming due. He was leaning against the back pole of her dressing tent, a cigarette dangling from his lips, looking as if he owned the place. What do you want, Hart? Pearl didn't turn around. She continued cleaning the grease paint from her face in the cracked mirror, her reflection a stranger's. Just came to see the show. Our show. He pushed off the pole and sauntered into the tent, picking up the pearl-handled prop gun from her cot. This is new. You always did like pretty things. It's a toy, she said, her voice flat. Is it? He sighted down the barrel at a poster of her on the tent wall, the one that called her the Petticoat Terror. Seems to me you've gotten pretty good at playing with toys that look real. He put the gun down. I hear congratulations are in order. A little bandit on the way. Pearl finally turned, her hand clutching the grimy rag. Don't what? He gave her that old crooked smile, the one that used to make her forget who he was. Don't take an interest in my family. I'm still your husband, last I checked. And the father of your children. Or did you forget about them? The words were a physical blow. She thought of her son and daughter in Ontario, being raised by her parents, strangers who knew her only as a name in a scandalous newspaper story. You don't get to talk about them, she said, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. I get to do whatever I want. He took a step closer, the scent of cheap whiskey and tobacco clinging to him like a shroud. You're famous now, Pearl. Rich. All on account of a story I had a starring role in. Seems to me the lead actor is entitled to a piece of the profits. You're not an actor. You're a ghost. A ghost who can get awful loud. His charming smile vanished, replaced by the familiar, hard-edged man she knew was always lurking underneath. A word from me to that reporter fella Egan. A different version of the story. The one where you weren't a reluctant hero, but a greedy little schemer who left her babies to run off with a gambler. How do you think that'll play? She had known this was coming. She had been waiting for it. She walked to the steel box under her cot, unlocked it, and took out a thin stack of bills. She didn't count it. She just threw it on the cot. Take it, she said. And then you disappear. He picked up the money, fanning it out with his thumb. This is a down payment, he said, stuffing it in his coat pocket. I'll be in touch about the rest of my share. He paused at the tent flap. It's good to see you, Pearl. You wear the fame well. It's a better look on you than the bruises ever were. He was gone, leaving the tent feeling colder and smaller than before. The next morning, she saw the new posters. Phineas T. Cole was directing the roustabouts as they pasted them over the old ones. This new version featured a lurid illustration of her shirt torn, a gun in each hand, her stomach noticeably impossibly rounded. The headline screamed, "See the Bandit Queen before she retires to motherhood." Pearl strode across the muddy grounds, her fists clenched. What is this, Phineas? Cole turned, his face beaming. Art, my dear. Promotion. We're selling a story, and every story needs a ticking clock. The baby is our ticking clock. You're selling a lie. We agreed you wouldn't mention the situation. I'm not mentioning it, I'm illustrating it, he said, gesturing to the poster with his cane. It's brilliant. It adds a layer of pathos, of feminine fragility. The public will eat it up. Take them down. Cole's smile tightened. That's not possible. The tickets for the next 3 weeks are nearly sold out. This poster is the reason why. You are a commodity, Pearl. My commodity. And I will sell you as I see fit. I'm the star of this show, she said, her voice shaking with a rage she hadn't felt since Yuma. You are the horse I bet on, he corrected her, his voice losing its charming edge. And you will run the race I tell you to run. Or you can go back to being a broke, forgotten ex-convict. The choice is yours. He turned his back on her and went back to directing his men, leaving her standing in the shadow of a grotesque, pregnant caricature of herself. She needed to get out. The feeling was a physical thing, a desperate clawing in her chest. She left the showgrounds, pulling her hat low, and walked into the city. She just wanted to feel normal for an hour, to be anonymous. She went into a dry goods store, the bell over the door jingling softly. The air inside smelled of bolts of cotton and cedar wood. She was looking at a simple gray calico dress, the kind of thing a farmer's wife might wear when the shopkeeper approached. "Can I help you, ma'am?" she asked, then her eyes widened in recognition. "Oh, my stars. It's you. You're her. You're Pearl Hart." The shopkeeper's voice was a stage whisper that carried through the entire store. 2 other customers turned to stare. I was just looking," Pearl stammered. "We saw your show last night," the woman gushed, grabbing Pearl's arm. "It was just thrilling. Weren't you terrified? My husband said he'd have fainted dead away." She leaned closer. "Is it true your partner, Joe Boot, was secretly in love with you?" "That's not." Pearl began, but the woman wasn't listening. "And the baby," she squealed. "To think of you, going through all that in your condition. You are the bravest woman in America." A man in overalls stepped forward. Would you sign my boy's cap? He's a great admirer of your marksmanship." They crowded around her, their faces a blur of intrusive smiles and hungry eyes. They weren't seeing her. They were seeing the poster. They were seeing the story Cole had invented. She felt the walls of the store closing in, the air growing thin. She backed away, knocking over a stack of folded shirts. "I have to go," she mumbled and fled, the bell over the door mocking her as she ran back into the street. She didn't stop until she was back in the familiar squalor of the showgrounds, in the suffocating privacy of her tent. She sat on the cot, her heart pounding. There was no escape. The Bandit Queen was more real than she was. The legend had eaten her alive. Her eyes fell on the steel box under her cot. It was her only hope, her only real plan. Hart would be back for more. Cole would keep selling his lies. The public would keep demanding their pound of flesh. She couldn't stay. She unlocked the box and pulled out the stacks of cash. She counted it again, her fingers moving with a feverish intensity. It was almost enough. Another 2 weeks, maybe 3. She stood and walked to the tent flap, peering out at the chaotic, artificial world Cole had built. A world built on her pain. She looked down at her hands. They were no longer the raw, red hands of a prison laundress. They were the soft, clean hands of a performer. She wasn't sure which version she hated more. With a sudden, decisive movement, she went back to the box, took out a single $20 bill, and tucked it deep into her boot. She left the tent and began walking, not toward the city, but toward the train depot at the edge of town. She wasn't buying a ticket, not yet. But she needed to see the schedules. She needed to look at the names of the towns, the lines on the map leading north. She needed to see the proof that another world, a real world, still existed. Chapter 24. He's doing it again. Pearl's voice was a low murmur from the wings. She watched Alistair, the actor playing Joe Boot, take his bow. He'd added a flourish, a little spin, and a wink to a pretty girl in the front row. It always got a cheer. "He's giving the people what they want, my dear," Phineas T. Cole said, not looking up from the night's receipts he was counting under a lantern. "A rogue. A charmer. A lovable scoundrel." Joe Boot was none of those things, Pearl said. He was a sweaty, desperate man who got us lost in the desert. And that, my dear, is why we have actors. Cole made a neat stack of bills and wrapped it with a paper band. The truth is often disappointing, and it rarely sells tickets. He handed her a letter that had arrived that afternoon. It was from a former inmate at Yuma, a forger named Silas she'd paid to keep an eye out for news. She slit the envelope open with her thumbnail. The letter was short, the handwriting a meticulous, elegant script that belied the grimness of the words. "Heard about your old partner," it read. "Boot. He and 2 others went over the wall during the night shift last month. They say he was shot trying to swim the river. They also say he might have made it. Found one body, but it was in the water a week. Hard to tell. Either way, he's gone. Buried in the prison yard, or a free man in Mexico. Thought you'd want to know." Pearl folded the letter, the thin paper crinkling in her hand. Presumed dead. Or free. A ghost with 2 possible futures. She felt a strange, hollow ache. Not grief, but the final, definitive closing of a door she hadn't even realized was still open. That night, the show felt different. When Alistair swaggered onto the stage, all false bravado and stage whiskey breath, she didn't see him. She saw the real Joe, his face purple with effort, as he tried to carry a $4,000 tombstone up a cliff. She saw his wild, terrified eyes when he realized the posse had found them. When she delivered her line, "Throw down the box," the words felt like ash in her mouth. The crowd roared its approval, but for the first time she felt like a fraud in her own story. After the show, a young man was waiting for her outside her tent. He was Chinese, dressed in a clean but patched American-style suit, and he held his hat in his hands. He looked nervous, but his eyes were direct and steady. "Miss Hart?" he asked. "I'm not signing autographs tonight," she said, moving to brush past him. "I am not asking for one," he said, his English precise with only a trace of an accent. "My name is Li Jin. I was a passenger on the Globe to Florence stage. On the 30th of May, 2 years ago." Pearl froze. She turned and looked at him, really looked at him. The face was older, thinner, but she remembered him. The silent man in the simple tunic, who had put his worn leather pouch on the ground without a word of protest. "What do you want?" she asked, her hand instinctively moving to the tent flap, as if she could retreat into the canvas and make him disappear. "To talk," he said simply. "May I?" He gestured toward the inside of her tent. She hesitated, then gave a short, sharp nod. Inside, she lit a lantern, the yellow light throwing their shadows long and distorted against the canvas walls. He did not sit. He just stood in the center of the small space, turning his hat in his hands. "I saw your poster in the city," he began. "It is a very dramatic picture." "It's a lie," Pearl said. "Yes," he said, a flicker of something, sadness maybe, in his eyes. "Lies are often more dramatic than the truth." He looked at her directly. "The truth is, I was on that stage because I was carrying my family's savings. Not a great fortune. $212. It was everything we had. I was going to Florence to buy a small plot of land. For a laundry. My wife's sister and her husband were to join us from San Francisco. Pearl said nothing. She could feel the floor shifting beneath her feet. The faceless victims of her story were beginning to resolve into a single, quiet man standing in her tent. "Your partner," Li Jin continued, his voice even, without a trace of accusation, "he took my pouch. He also took a small, carved wooden bird from my pocket. It was a toy. For my son. He had asked me to bring him a present from my trip." The carved bird. She remembered seeing it in the pile of loot Joe had dumped on the ground. A small, insignificant piece of wood. She hadn't thought of it again until this moment. "I read about your trial," he said. "I read what you said. About your mother. About having no choice. I understand having no choice. My family came to this country because we had no choice." He finally looked down at the hat in his hands. "When the money was gone, my wife's sister could not come. Her husband grew ill. The laundry was never built. My wife, she works mending clothes for the miners now. Her hands are always sore." He wasn't angry. That was the terrible part. He was just telling her the facts, connecting the dots between her desperate act and his quiet, diminished life. The $4,000 in the box had been an abstract fortune. But this man's $212, his laundry, his wife's sore hands, that was real. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Because I saw your show tonight," he said, finally looking up again. "I saw the people cheering. They cheer for the story of the brave lady bandit. They do not cheer for the story of the man who lost his laundry. It is not a very good story." He took a step toward the tent flap. "I do not want your money, Miss Hart. It is too late for that. I just wanted you to know the other story. The one that does not sell tickets." He placed his hat on his head, gave her a slight formal bow, and was gone, disappearing into the chaotic night of the showgrounds. Pearl stood alone in the lantern light, the smell of sawdust and cheap perfume suddenly suffocating. She walked to the steel box under her cot and opened it. Inside lay the stacks of cash, the profits from her fame, the wages of her sin. It looked different now. It looked heavy. Tainted. She thought of Joe Boot, shot dead in a river or drinking tequila in Mexico. A ghost. She thought of Li Jin's wife, her hands raw from mending other people's clothes. A ghost of a different kind. Her past was not a story to be performed. It was a string of consequences, a debt that could never be truly repaid. She reached into the box and took out $300, far more than she could afford to part with. She found a clean envelope and a piece of paper. She sat down, but she didn't know what to write. An apology was a useless insult. An explanation was a coward's excuse. In the end, she wrote only a few words on the paper, "for the laundry." She sealed the money and the note in the envelope. She had no idea how she would find Li Jin, or if he would even accept it. But she knew she had to try. She tucked the envelope into her dress, blew out the lantern, and stepped out of the tent, leaving the Bandit Queen behind in the dark. Chapter 25. Rent's due Friday, Mrs. Evans. The landlady, Mrs. Gable, had a voice like grinding stones. She stood in the doorway of Pearl's rented room, her arms crossed over a formidable bosom, her eyes taking in the room's sparse contents, a narrow bed, a rickety washstand, a single carpet bag on the floor. "I'm aware," Pearl said, not looking up from the newspaper she was pretending to read. The classifieds were a desert of opportunity. Clerk wanted, male; drayman wanted, strong back rec; accountant references essent. "Just so we're clear," Mrs. Gable said, her gaze lingering on the single plain dress hanging on a hook. "This is a respectable house. No callers. No late hours. And no credit. We're clear." The door clicked shut, leaving Pearl in the silence of the third-floor room. Mrs. Evans. The name felt like a borrowed coat, ill-fitting and strange. She had gotten off the train in Kansas City 2 weeks ago with a little over $100. The rest of the money from the steel box sent in a thick, anonymous envelope to a Catholic mission in St. Louis with a note that said only find a man named Lee Jin. Kansas City was a city of smoke and noise, a place where the West came to sell its cattle and lose its money. It was a good place to disappear. But disappearing, she was learning, was more expensive than being famous. She spent her days walking. She learned the city through the soles of her worn-out boots. She saw the cattle pens, a sprawling city of mud and misery, and the fine brick houses on the bluffs, their windows like blank, judging eyes. She learned the geography of want, the invisible lines that separated a hot meal from a cold night. She tried the restaurants first. The proprietors looked at her hands, no longer the raw, red hands of a prison laundress, but not the calloused, capable hands of a lifelong cook either. "You got references, lady?" a man with a greasy apron asked her, not bothering to take the cigar out of his mouth. "I'm a fast learner," she said. "I need a fast worker, not a fast learner. Get out of my kitchen." She tried the dress shops. Her knowledge of fabrics and stitching, drilled into her by her mother, was still there. But the women who ran the shops saw something else in her eyes, a hardness that didn't belong among bolts of silk and lace. "I'm sorry, dear," one of them said, her voice full of a pity that was worse than contempt. "You're just not the type we're looking for." The money in her boot dwindled. $1 for the room. A dime for a bowl of soup. A nickel for a newspaper full of jobs she couldn't have. She could feel the old instincts stirring, the cold, pragmatic calculus she'd learned from Cora and Hattie. She would watch a man in a saloon flash a roll of bills, and she would know, with a certainty that frightened her, exactly how to separate him from it. She would see a shopkeeper turn his back on an open cash drawer and feel a ghost of a whisper in her mind, "Easy." She pushed the thoughts away. She was Mrs. Evans now. Mrs. Evans was respectable. Mrs. Evans paid her rent. On a cold, drizzly Thursday, with Mrs. Gable's deadline looming, Pearl found herself outside a small cigar store on a quiet side street. The sign in the window was hand-painted, H. Klein, Tobacconist. Below it, another smaller sign, freshly written, "Help Wanted." She pushed the door open. A small bell tinkled. The air inside was warm, and smelled of sweet tobacco, cedarwood, and old paper. An elderly man with a kind, tired face and a magnificent white mustache looked up from behind the counter. He was polishing a briar pipe with a soft cloth. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice a gentle German accent. "I saw the sign in your window," Pearl said, her own voice sounding too loud in the quiet shop. The man, Mr. Klein, looked her up and down. His gaze was not suspicious or dismissive, just observant. "The sign is for a stock boy. To unpack the crates, sweep the floors." "I can do that," she said. "I'm strong." He gave a small, sad smile. "I am sure you are. But the work is not for a lady." "I'm not a lady," Pearl said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "I'm just a woman who needs a job." He studied her for a long moment, his pale blue eyes taking in the worn dress, the determined set of her jaw, the shadows of Yuma that still lingered in her eyes. "You are new to the city." "Yes." "You have family here?" "No." He sighed and went back to polishing his pipe. "I am sorry. It would not be proper. The men who come in here, they would not understand." He looked up, a genuine regret in his eyes. "I wish you luck." It was the last door. The final rejection. Pearl stood there, the smell of the tobacco making her feel dizzy with hunger. She had $2 and a few cents left to her name. Not enough for Mrs. Gable. Not enough for a train ticket to anywhere else. She was at the bottom, again. She looked around the shop. It was small, neat, and quiet. Mr. Klein was the only one here. The cash register on the counter was an old ornate brass model. The back room, she could see through the curtained doorway, probably led to an alley. It would be simple. So simple. The Bandit Queen stirred within her, a cold, familiar presence. She knew how this would play out. A quick move, a hand in her coat pocket as if she had a gun. The old man wouldn't be a hero. He'd give her the money. She could be gone before he even thought to call for help. Mr. Klein finished with his pipe and set it carefully in a display case. He looked at her, still standing by the door. "Is there something else?" he asked, his voice gentle. Pearl's mind was a whirlwind. She saw the road to Florence, the cold contempt in the passenger's eyes. She saw Li Jin's face, the quiet dignity of his pain. She saw the bars of the Yuma prison. And she saw the endless, grinding road of being Mrs. Evans, a life of cheap rooms and closed doors. She took a step forward, away from the door, toward the counter. Her face was a blank mask, her eyes hard and unreadable. She stopped directly in front of him, her hands resting on the polished wood of the countertop. "I'm a fast learner," she said, her voice low and even. "And I can read people. I know what a man wants before he does. I know a liar from a fool, and a cheapskate from a man with money to burn." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "You don't need a boy to sweep your floors, Mr. Klein. You need someone who can sell your cigars. Love audiobooks? Get over 100 Wild Western audiobook on YouTube. Subscribe for full listens, no fluff. Wild Western Roundup. Want even more action-packed adventures in the Wild West? Join the posse. Download your free copy of Wrangler today. Or keep reading the Rip Campbell Wild Western series in Amazon. Wild Western Rip Campbell Adventures. Duckfoot Ranch. Pecan Creek War. Scatter Shot. $10 Mustang. Pistol Whipped. Red River Ferry. Last Drop. Cow Puncher. Bearcat Pass. Fast Shot. As Good as Gold. Ramble Range. Claim Jumper. Gunpowder Trouble. Bushwhack Range. Bearwash War. Kicking Dust. Outlaw Range. Six Gun Preacher. Or grab one half of these in the box set on Amazon. Saddle up. Want all 30 Wild Western novels in one massive box set bundle? There are even more Wild Western adventures waiting on you at the pass. Head 'em off. The end.